Fear and Hunger is filled to the brim with some of the most unsettling and interesting enemies in modern gaming. From the embodiment of dysmorphia, guilt and grudges, fallen divinity living in the shadow of human civilization, doctors warped by what can only be described as the devil, and a supercomputer promising a better world. However, behind some of the most abhorrent depictions of humanity's worst excesses and a game so difficult most choose against playing it are scattered hints of lore that come together to build one of the most groundbreaking and stomach-churning but immensely detailed worlds in all of gaming. But what happens if we strip them of the confines of gameplay mechanics and dug into the journal entries, item descriptions, dialogue and environmental clues to figure out who is the most powerful enemy encounter? Once again, I have done just that. Using only the lore, I've ranked every single enemy in the entire game, all here on this list. Be prepared to go from the trauma of an orphanage all the way to cosmic horrors as we rank the most powerful enemy in Fear and Hunger 2 Termina, according only to the lore. Our next stop, Preheville. As the weakest enemy on the list, the Fallen Cherub can be encountered fittingly within the orphanage, as they are or were children arrested in development due to what appears to be the result of being boiled alive through the Sulphur God's influence or scorched by Rare's light. More on both the Sulphur God and Moonscorching incoming entries, as it feels wrong making this entry any longer than it needs to be. Dawn medically examines the body of the Fallen Cherub as extremely frail but curiously having developed claws to attack the player, carrying the physique of not just an infant but an incredibly frail and vulnerable being. They are one intentional attack away from death and rely entirely on precise scratches to defend themselves. Truth be told, much like the Fallen Cherubs, there is literally nothing to go by when speaking on the Fecal Hounds directly, but we can deduce a few environmental clues about what they are and potentially how dangerous they're supposed to be. The Fecal Hounds can be encountered throughout the alleys of Preheville. The term hound may indicate these beings were once domesticated dogs, and just like the Fallen Cherubs, their burned thin skin may also point towards Moonscorching, having affected them in a similar way to the other residents of Preheville. Once again, more on Moonscorching as a concept for our next entry. Nevertheless, Dawn diagnoses the creatures as having once been dogs with fur, but scorching or boil damage having rendered their bodies incredibly frail and with internal damage, which may explain their aggression and incontinence. These conditions would make them vectors for disease, and when they're not pooing uncontrollably, their bites and scratches can infect the player. In the game, they join the Fallen Cherubs as the weakest enemy to all forms of damage, and in the lore, as per Dawn's description, just as weak. Ranking here on the list a step above the Fallen Cherubs due to the poison and infection they can inflict. While the Ratkin are without a doubt one of the weakest enemies in the game, with dialogue making abundantly clear they are an incredibly anxious species, seeking only to be left alone deep below Earth, they actually give us insight into one of the biggest changes in the world after the events of Fear and Hunger 1. We learn at the end of Fear and Hunger 1 the God of the Depths would be no more, and in its place a new deity would be born, the God of Fear and Hunger. In the first game we learn all insects, vermin and scavenger species were associated with the God of the Depths. Affinity to this god even allowed one to communicate with these beings. Enki's Skin Bible explicitly states that the God of the Depths perished the night the God of Fear and Hunger was born, but perished may be far too extreme a word, as the existence of the Ratkin, and specifically the affinity spell known as Mastery over Vermin aligned to the God of Fear and Hunger, indicates that the God of the Depths' influence remains alive within the God of Fear and Hunger. Subsequently, the beings that were either born of the depths may have had to adapt to the new material conditions of this new deity. This may explain why the Ratkin exist only in the second installment. On medical examination, we're told their bodies are frail, but the characteristics align to both human and rat species. However, this combination would produce a being that is directly told to not harness any of the positive traits of either species. Their body seems weak against pretty much anything, fitting for a being to resemble most the anxiety and destitution the god of fear and hunger would come to represent. In a battle, much like the fecal hounds, they can scratch and bite, passing infection and disease onto the player, but their greater sentience and wider variety of attacks firmly places them above the poo dogs. In the first video, we spoke about the darkness of the God of the Depths and its mutating properties. While initially it was assumed mutations were entirely related to the God of the Depths, we learned from Fear and Hunger 2 that it may be more accurately assumed that all old gods had the ability to mutate lesser beings. Why this is likely relates entirely to the eldritch proportions of the old gods, concepts in their rawest forms, and thus even slight exposure to even its traces able to change the reality and physiology of beings unable to truly grasp its magnitude. While we'll go into the details of Rare's power later in the list, we learn the traces of Rare commanded by the selfish Perkele had the ability to inflict Moonscorch, or in some cases also known as Moonlight Cancer. Not unlike the darkness of the God of the Depths, Moonscorch had a tendency to bring out the most prevalent and often most taboo traits of an individual, forcing one to sometimes become an embodiment of their worst and most abundant excesses. However, unlike the God of the Depths, we learn the Moonscorch were selective rather than agnostic, indicating a choice by Perkele to inflict this disease upon those who chose against participating in the Termina festival. The nature of the Termina festival before Perkele's usurpation is hard to know for certain. The old gods tell us it's a continued tradition first initiated by the true moon god Rare, and would often pit lesser beings against each other until one came out on top and was offered a grand prize, the nature to which is also speculative, but may have existed to ensure humanity would never ascend as gods by pitting them against each other. Within the events of Fear and Hunger 2, we learn Perkele intertwined with the Sulphur god was merely using the traces of Rare for his own ends, something reiterated by the new gods in the Grand Hall 2, and something we'll go into in more detail for his respective entry. But to put the story back into the perspective of this entry, we learn the Moonscorched ghouls represented the ordinary denizens of Old Preheville who chose cowardice in the face of the Termina festival, becoming deeply mutated for these actions with their skin flaying and becoming an embodiment of anxiety and fear. While most Moonscorched ghouls are deep set in this anxiety and fear, unable to even fight us, eventually they too lose their minds and become more feral in nature, fighting us with just their bare hands, scratching and biting, their bodies already on the brink of collapse. In this form they are savage and raving, uncaring for their own mortality, a distinction that places them here on the list. Shadowy figures are as elusive within the gameplay as they are in the lore, as there isn't anything directly related to them in items, dialogues, or even books, but the environment they occupy and the design of the figures does give us enough to flesh them out. St. Domec's orphanage was founded by Father Domec, the head of the Church of All Mer that primarily governed Preheville. While we'll save Domec's story for the decrepit priest entry, we learn the orphanage was actually a front for the clergy to use as experimentation fodder as they delved deeper into the occult, as the Church of All Mer that governed Preheville was in fact led by a cabal of dark priests more concerned with polytheistic research. In this institution, there would be wide-reaching abuse levied against the orphans, and with no formal caretakers, this was mostly done without any scrutiny from the wider town, and by the time we arrive in Preheville, it has mostly been abandoned, with the headmaster, Father Hugo, having packed his things ready to leave. Within these halls are the remnants of abused orphans, and while we spoke about the fallen cherubs, beside them were also the shadowy figures, spirit remnants of tortured souls that still haunt the hallways. Much like the Minor Spectre in the first game, their unrest has made them malicious forces, unable to be harmed by physical attacks, and once encountered they fight us with their bare hands, dealing damage exclusively to our mind. Even when compared to the Minor Spectre from the first game, it's implied their damage to your mind is minimal, as the spell Ruin used by the Minor Spectres is able to deteriorate the mind at an incredibly fast rate, whereas the Phantom Hand spell used by the shadowy figures is described in much looser terms. The spell itself being referred to as Phantom Hands indicates this being is just attempting to reach out and be saved from the trauma it has endured. With the caveat that they can only be harmed by otherworldly powers, they do however have an edge over some of the more early entries, and can situationally be an impossible task to overcome for many characters. Despite hundreds of years passing between Fear and Hunger 1 and 2, we learn even the smaller legacies of the events surrounding the first game echo in the world today, one of which of course being the creation of Jagged Jaws. After the events of the new god Francois' ascension at the Golden Throne, carrying the dominating soul, he would enact his ideals of world unification, using his power to make the world bend to his will, and standing as the figurehead of the Fellowship as they ushered in a new world order. However, beside these lofty accomplishments, we know he was incredibly selfish, and thus hated that he couldn't be in more places than one, and upon taking residence in Mahabra for good, he would selectively breed a cohort of wolves until they were extremely ravenous hounds that he could release upon the world to represent his maintained influence. These hounds would be known to us as the Jagged Jaws, bloodthirsty wolfhounds that saw only the taste of blood. It's not hard to assume the Jagged Jaws would rise as an apex of dogs, until eventually most hound breeds would carry their traits and, more importantly, Francois' influence. This also explains why the Headless is the way it is, but also gives the context that the Headless is not just an ordinary aggressive wolf or dog, but a harsh lineation from the Jagged Jaws, likely mulled in temperament through further domestication. We can find the Headless near the woodsman's shack, which again plays into this further domestication. However, one incredibly crucial fact to note is that the Headless may also have suffered from moonscorching, accounting for his head being missing and its inability to bite with teeth, making his physical attacks near negligible even in terms of lore. However, he does have the ability to spew black vomit, a poisonous hurl that can damage and harm the player, a unique aspect of moonscorching not seen anywhere else in the game. This, combined with their inherent aggression, give them the trump card over the more ordinary moon-scorched frail ghouls. Following on from the previous entries, we have the villagers, and insight into what the moonscorched ghouls may have looked like prior to becoming entirely mutated. The key difference here is that the villagers, unlike the moonscorched ghouls, while still embodiments of cowardice in their choice against participating in the Termina festival, are still functioning, attempting normalcy in their old society while suffering deeply from Rare's moonlight burns and crippled minds. This attempt at normalcy is best displayed in the death animation at the hands of the pipe-wielding villager, who throws our corpse into a pig pen, still feeding their livestock, as if their agrarian society is still worth holding on to. The key differentiator, of course, between the villager and the previous entries is their functioning human physique, sentience, and ability to use modern weaponry, something lost to the moonscorched ghouls as they succumb to Rare's light within the slums of Old Town. Upon medical examination of the rat hag's body, we learn that unlike her naming convention would have you believe, she isn't a ratkin, rather a human who was moonscorched and would take her insanity-riddled mind deep into the sewers, eventually finding solace amongst rats in her isolation. As we learned from the Ratkin entry, rats would come to represent the god of fear and hunger. Of course, this god symbolised the anxiety of the constant crushing conditions of humanity and the will to continue. It's thus not surprising the rat hag cherished this environment and formed a close bond with the rats too. In the game, as we meet the rat hags deep in the sewers, it's clear their minds are deeply ailed, marking our presence with an uneasy plea for closeness, eventually culminating into a fight where she summons upon rats to battle us. On medical examination, we're told the rat hag's body is surprisingly durable and clearly covered in moonscorch, not unlike the ghouls and villagers of Old Town, but without the fresh flaying. There are theories that suggest she may be the result of a previous Termina festival and was driven underground to survive the festival, which may explain her old age and presence in the sewers too. Her ability to summon rats, more durable body and clear targeted aggression and overall sentience place her a peg above the more emaciated victims of Old Town. The Centaur will be a quick entry, as we don't get a great deal of information about it aside from one striking trait, this of course being the realisation that it is in fact a Sylvian marriage between a horse and a man. Found deep in the deepest woods, it will charge at the player engaging in a battle. As we learned from the first game, Sylvian marriages are the ritual combining of flesh between two consenting beings. Often the marriage would represent the greater traits of both. We don't get any information about the nature of the human or the horse in question, so it's assumed both are just ordinary beings that happen to, do the ritual. Nasty stuff. In a battle, the centaur is more bullish than horseish and charges at the player with its hulking size. From Darn's description, we also know Rare's light may have malformed the creature too, speaking on burned and boiled skin akin to moonscorching of the cocooning variant. Cocooning, of course, often callousing skin until they host an extremely hard exterior, which actually plays well into the strength of the centaur. Relying entirely on its physical capabilities, its speed and size make it far more a literal threat than ordinary moonscorched ghouls, villagers, and smaller creatures. Despite a change in naming convention, the Vial is for all intents and purposes a villager. Found at the gates of Old Town and carrying a canister and mask, it suggested the Vial is a moonscorched villager who may have once been a fisher or a farmer. It's indicated the Vial was moonscorched during his duties, as his mask, originally used to stop the pesticides from being inhaled, has been scorched onto his face. A unique coin flip even allowing us to immediately win the fight if we can aggravate him enough for him to take his own mask off. In our battle, he relies almost entirely on turning the canister towards us, and this canister is extremely toxic to the player. As the setting of Fear and Hunger 2 pays homage to World War II from our own world, it suggests this very well may be chlorine gas, and thus a literal bioweapon of extremely high concentration. Despite carrying a different name and being much harder within the game itself, the Vial is, in many ways, not dissimilar to the villagers, albeit with what seems to be more agency and a far deadlier weapon. Despite having identical dialogue and stature to the ordinary villager's entry, the key distinction between the villager and the Vial to the rifleman, aside from their naming convention, is of course a big old rifle. Found patrolling through the riverside derelict house in central Preheville, they're garbed in business attire, indicating some higher standing within the community, and may, unlike the villagers, be linked to the city rather than the outskirts and Old Town, and thus closer proximity to Percolet's influence itself within the Hollow Tower. Despite Fear and Hunger 2 taking place in an era where modern weapons have evolved heavily, it's rare to find a moonscorched being taking advantage of these modern weapons, and despite being exactly the same physiologically to both the Vial and villagers, gives them a greater edge and puts them here on the list. Found within Preheville's ruined streets, we learn the soldiers are not native to Bohemia, rather members of Kaiser's and thus the Bremen Empire's army. We learn they found themselves in Preheville under Kaiser's order after the Second World War. Dialogue with the Bremen soldier indicates he was one of a large cohort of other soldiers instructed to come to Preheville to secure the secret underground bunker harbouring the great machine god Logic. More on Logic for its respective entry, but what's more important to note here is that the Bremen soldier has clearly found himself at the mercy of the Termina festival. He speaks of the Moonscorch having maddened him and his comrades, and how he is one of a few with a semblance of sanity left. He talks of having betrayed his own commanding officers and shooting them on sight, likely as he too had visions given to him by Percolet and forced to participate in the Termina festival. When we meet him, he's privy to the battle royale nature of the event and is eager to send us to an early grave in order to survive, much like he had his former comrades. Despite being a self-aware soldier, he doesn't hold any special traits associated with the main contestants. His Moonscorch is common, and upon body examination, his physique not unlike many of the other Moonscorched littering Preheville streets. We know out of all of his comrades, he is the only one left standing. We can see a variety of dead Bremen soldiers of his type already having been killed throughout Preheville, with some indication he may have been the person responsible. When we go up against him, his dialogue is nihilistic, and it's clear he's nearing the end of his own sanity. At the cusp of joining his fallen comrades, holding a pistol and clearly well trained by the Bremen army, he stands a peg above the rifleman due to his clear military training. As touched on earlier, the half-cocooned is once again another example of how moonscorching can affect people differently based on their inherent traits and location. The half-cocooned can be found strewn across Preheville, from the apartment to alleys and even the streets. They answer the question, what happened to the industrial class found at the heart of Preheville? And from observation, it seems they have been taken hold of by a more utilitarian moonscorching, their bodies not flaying, rather calloused and blunt, proxies for the festivities of Termina, and flavour to the festival as a whole, no doubt linked to their roles as physical labourers. Their curious naming convention may even give indication that they were once deemed worthy as participants to the festival itself, as we learn the cocoon enemy later in the list is actually just the fully moonscorched version of Marina, and as we will learn later, the moonscorching related to cocooning doesn't really hinder one's fighting abilities, and in many cases actually makes one more powerful altogether, even embellishing Marina with more aggressive physical and spellcasting attacks and a far more resilient body, able to withstand even bullet fire, and thus the half-cocooned ranks above the more frail soldier. Bar a literal dishwasher, the irrational obelisk may be the most unique entry on this list. Found within the shopping streets of Preheville, the obelisk seems to be just a pile of shirts, and in truth, that's exactly what it is. So you ask me, why does it rank so high if it's just a pile of shirts? Well, in reality, there is more to this enemy than just that. When encountered, the obelisk has near infinite health and is able to drain your sanity at an extremely high rate. Why this is may actually have everything to do with its name. It's a play on the characters, but also you as a player's declining sanity as you continue to play the game. And despite the battle being obviously futile, it tests how long you're willing to fight it before literally going insane and dying. Thus, the obelisk is a representation of Preheville and the Termina Festival's effect on the sanity of its participants and victims. Fear and Hunger is a game that pays heavy attention to the existence of concepts, even immortalizing concepts as gods. While the irrational obelisk is not a god or the concept of insanity itself, there's reason to assume the material conditions of Preheville may have caused insanity to take a physical form in the irrational obelisk. But the clarity around this stays muddy, and thus, as the wildcard on the list, it ranks here. While we'll save the story of Stitches for her respective entry, we learn the Sojob's existence is credited wholly to Stitches, a sulphur worshipper aligned to Perkele and the festival of Termina within Preheville. As a brief overview, however, Stitches was once the daughter to a renowned medic known as Baron Einar von Dutch, a man initially beholden to Sylvian and her restorative traits, but later led down a path of sulphur worship until he sacrificed himself and his daughter in a sulphur ritual, eventually causing both to be reborn in its wretched image, and led to Preheville under the tutelage of Perkele. We learn Stitches would find her place under Perkele as a summoner of sorts, utilising the excess sacrificed limbs related to Preheville's conjuration of the sulphur god dimension, and reappropriating them in a twisted patchwork of body parts, combining her knowledge of Sylvian's restorative properties, and particularly the art of Sylvian marriages associated with combining flesh, to create beings to act as denizens of Preheville and proxies for the sulphur god's growing presence. This is precisely where sojobs come into the mix. Upon medical examination, we're told the sojobs are of excellent quality, and there's indication that they're propped up through divine invocation. Whether this is of the sulfur god, Sylvian, or even rare remains up to interpretation. But if we engage in dialogue with them, they present incredible sentience, trying to steal from the player and inferring gratitude towards their lady, who of course is most likely Stitches herself. As we know, Sylvian's influence had a hand in the creation of these beings, as Stitches is the daughter of a great Sylvian medic. It's reasonable to assume they may adopt the merits of Sylvian marriages, fusing the strength of each individual combined, as was the case for Sylvian marriages in the first game. It's inferred many beings were fused in the creation of sojobs, and as they retain both sentience and top physical form, as indicated by their medical examination, it's no doubt why sojobs would be tasked with converting on Prehevil on the eve of Perkale's Great Festival, acting in the strength of Sylvian powered by the Sulphur God. While they don't use any otherworldly affinities, they do stand tall as one of the more complex and powerful regular physical enemies. As one of the most vile contestants in the game, Caligura is presented to us as a non-playable character stuck in the same predicament as the rest of the crew. However, unlike many others, he is in fact playing by Perkale's rules and seeks to murder as many of the contestants as he possibly can. This also gives us a unique look at the true law-relative power of Caligura to a few of the others, as we do know he can, on his own, defeat both Levi and Henrique in their respective non-moon-scorched forms. Caligura's early life, as we learn, is a little muddy, but relates entirely to the mob, with affiliations not unlike Marco within Vatican City. During his time in the city, he would build a name for himself as an infamous mobster, enough so that journalists Karen and potentially Henrique know who he is before even entering Prehevil. He would often be referred to as Count Draggle due to his appearance and personality, a moniker that may have held true as very early into the festival he's condescending towards the other contestants and even assaults Abella, Levi, Henrique and even Marco when given the chance. However, it may be incorrect to automatically assume he's stronger than some of the contestants he defeats. As we know, during Levi's kill scene, he's clearly taken advantage of Levi's trust and supposed mental instability, seeming to catch him in the midst of a panic attack. However, during the Day 2 night, we can find Caligura having transformed into a being known as the Monster, a physical representation of his worst excesses. In this, he becomes a huge ballsack. Fitting, if you ask me. Unlike the other moon-scorched contestants, it appears Caligura's transformation doesn't lend itself to a trait recognised as inherently linked to his power, rather one linked to his moniker as Count Draggle, his transformation a vile and putrid thing relying on literal puke and flaying his many arms. Though not necessarily a medical observation within the game, his moonscorching seems to take a non-cocooning archetype. His body is soft and mostly weak to attacks you'd ordinarily consider ineffective against this archetype, and thus he ranks far below many of the other upcoming moonscorched contestants, but on the merit of how offensive, toxic and prevalent his putrid bodily fluids are, and his heightened aggression and various offensive limbs, he is a greater threat than the previous entries. While there are barely any context clues related to the Death Mask, we learn from the items that they can drop that they used to be residents of old Bohemia. As we learn, Bohemia and the setting for modern-day Prehevil is known as a region far east of Europa. Their geographical location would unfortunately have them under siege by various belligerent factions. In modern times, we know the Bremen Empire and the Eastern Union would take advantage of its vast natural resources and exploit the land to develop technological advancements, and the Bremen Empire ultimately sieging Bohemia and putting it under the direct authority of the Kaiser, for what we learn were pending technological leaps of his own in the modern day. However, as the Death Masks are told to be historic residents of old Bohemia, the actions that would desolate Bohemia to its modern standard play no part in their being. Rather, they seem to represent what Bohemia may have looked like before becoming a hotbed for colonial expansion. We learned Bohemia was best known for its diverse biomes and large forests, something that came under threat frequently, and as we learn later from the Owl Cultist entry, old Bohemia lived cohesively with nature, and as this came under threat, they would need to militarize in order to defend it. It's thus by reason we can assume the death masks were its militarized people. The death mask item reads, a burial mask used in Old Bohemia. The mask is designed so that the death gurgle of its wearer sounds more like laughter. Because of its connection to death, the mask has otherworldly properties, suggesting the residents of Bohemia may have clad their warriors in this mask said to have been enchanted by otherworldly properties. And while we can't say for certain what deity this is from, we do know Venushka or Ninush were revered heavily in this small section of the world, and she may be responsible for their ability to resurrect and the resilience brought upon them to act as steadfast guardians of the deeper woods even to its modern day. Carrying two large machetes, they stand physically tall by sprite alone and have some of the largest health pools in the game. And while gameplay means nothing to this list, this does play into the idea that they were enhanced with great fortitude by Ninush as they stood as her immortal guardians of the woods. However, as we can find the death masks far away from the still preserved nature of Prehville, it does assume they died failing to protect the nature relevant to where they were located, and thus, with all that being combined, they rank here on the list. As mentioned in the Ratkin entry, the beekeepers are yet another example of the god of the depths' persevering influence in a world where they have been replaced by the god of fear and hunger. Darn describes the anatomy of the beekeeper as strangely empty and resembling a collection of beehives that oddly seem humanoid in nature. We know the god of the depths, as described by the first game, had the ability to turn humans, specifically in the case of the butterfly, into insectoid beings. Whether the beekeepers have been this way since the God of the Depths' presence in the first game, or whether this is a transformation that happened after being replaced by the God of Fear and Hunger, is not entirely elaborated on, but does raise some interesting implications. In the game, we can encounter a bee-infested bed and near it the sigil of the God of the Depths, which may indicate that the modern world is moving past the cruel age induced by the God of Fear and Hunger, and her influence is finally waning, giving way for the God of the Depths and specifically its divine invocation to re-emerge in the modern world. We don't find any other worshippers of the God of the Depths within this game, and it may suggest if the God of the Depths is re-emerging, it's re-emerging in very small pockets within the world as little beehives. As a battle from a lore perspective, the beekeepers are able to send bees to poison the player, and able to take advantage of its hulking size physically dominating the player too. The beekeeper's huge muscular size may actually be a homage to the same effect the God of the Depths had to the guards in the first game, inflating their muscles to a place where they would become one of the dominant forces within the dungeons of Fear and Hunger. And in many ways, all things point towards the beekeepers holding similar physical traits, and ironically their stinger is actually from bees this time. Described by its medical diagnosis as once being human, the neighbour is one of the more brutal transformations related to moonscorching, and represents one of the two types of moonscorching that can occur amongst regular civilians. To rehash, moonscorching affects people differently. As we learn from the villager entry, this condition would often bring upon the worst excesses of one's personal traits. The villagers cowardly in the face of the Termina festival became hollowed ghouls with skin flaying and left in eternal agony, whereas those closer to the festival and deemed worthy to become a part of the festival itself became hulking beasts with calloused or cocooned skin, ready to bludgeon at a moment's notice. We also learned the neighbours were all first residents of the white mould apartments. While the white mould phenomenon and its effects are not told to us directly, we do know a great deal of sacrifices may have occurred here, pointing towards the divine invocation of the sulphur god, and the mould may be traces of the sulphur god corrupting the residents, unsurprising as the apartment would become the gateway between the real world and the sulphur dimension in our own playthrough. This may also explain why Perkele, commanding the traces of Rare and pointing its scorch to his will, may have seen the residents within this apartment as having been corrupted by the sulphur god via proximity to the mold, and thus deemed them worthy of aggressive and powerful transformations to act as obstacles within the Termina festival itself. As remember, the festival, while historically related to Rare, has been hijacked by Perkele to act as a means to pursue the sulphur god's work. This makes the neighbour very similar to the Rontiel and even the more usual cocooned archetype of moon-scorched enemies, but further in strength due to Dahn's comment of their far greater physique and giant structure, which is exemplified best by its repertoire able to smash foes with its hulking limbs, but also their association to being a similar transformation as the very powerful Marco. While Marco's respective entry is later in the list, he is without a doubt one of the most physically powerful contestants, and his moon-scorched form being an exaggeration of his great physical strength, being near identical to the neighbours, elevates the neighbours as somewhat adjacently physically powerful. The story of the woodsman may be one of the more outrageous within the entire series. We're told he was once an ordinary civilian within Preheville who had made home for himself on the outskirts of town, likely as a lumberjack. His route to insanity, unlike many of the other citizens, is implied to have taken place before the Termina festival. We learn from the woodsman's letter that he was involved with a tumultuous marriage with indications of his abuse. The abuse would be drastic enough his wife would cheat on him with Black Kaliv, a goat. Whether this was fueled on delirium or the goat was, as his wife indicates, more than just a goat, is not entirely necessary to speculate on, as we know this would spur within him self-destructive ideals with ideas of killing his wife and then himself. However, on the eve of these acts, and upon actually killing his wife, the Termina festival would begin, and in the scorches of Rare's light, or even the potential for a certain parasite born of Rare's light attaching itself to him, the woodsman would mutate into the worst excesses of his personality, filling his body with rage and allowing his rage to give him a new lease in life. In the Old Town slums, we can meet a being known as the Wretched. While clearly moon-scorched too, he chooses against hostility but does give us exposition that the woodsman embraced the Moonscorch and travelled into Old Town, murdering at least half of its populace in his rage. Upon examining his body, we're told of a deeply misleading muscular figure, and on our fight with him, it's clear, unlike the others of Old Town, the moon has not victimized him, rather made him more empowered in his most violent traits. His body now hosts to a parasite able to incapacitate others, leaving them open to his attacks. In a similar way, he is also one of the few moon-scorched that seem quite coherent, in certain instances forming full sentences and seemingly admiring the nihilism brought upon the world by the Termina festival. On his face is a parasite, a similar parasite to the one that attached itself to Abella, turning her into the monstrous Shogna, an extremely powerful entity. The nature of this parasite is anyone's guess, but it's clear the existence of this does enhance the transformation of its victim in twisted and extremely aggressive ways. The doppelgangers are some of the most confusing enemies lore-wise in this game, as their strength seems inherently connected to who they choose to mimic, and their personal origins are near impossible to ascertain with the information we have at this given moment. While some theories may suggest they're aligned to Perkele or the Termina festival, this is entirely unlikely, as a majority of doppelgangers in the game, aside from Doppelganger Levi, are entirely harmless, only fighting back in self-defense, rather than the malice you'd expect from a being linked to the Termina festival. However, even if we can't point out their origins or the nature of their power, we can assess their strength based on how well they can mimic the power of their subjects, which in most cases, but in particular for the case of Tanaka, suggests the doppelganger is an inherently weaker being than the object of their mimicry. In truth, this still remains incredibly difficult to rank, as they don't host any inherent benchmark of power, and thus it may be more important to rank the doppelganger based on the most powerful version of its mimicry we can face in the game. And without going into spoilers, this of course is the mimicry of the immensely powerful Marina. Marina's doppelganger is able to use Black Smog, which is a high affinity Gorgoroth spell, and while we won't spoil Marina's own respective entry on this list, it positions the doppelgangers as an extension of a true prodigy to the great otherworldly powers of Gorgoroth, with the caveat that all lore pointers suggest they were lesser imitations of their fuller respective humans, which may in itself be due to an early stage of mimicry that we never get to see fully develop. Present only in the pocket dimension initially believed to be related to the moon god Re, we can encounter Rontiel strewn across Re's dimension. We say initially believed to be Re's dimension as we learn Perkele, the figure responsible for commanding the traces of Re, may not have been a direct servant to Re herself and instead a cultist aligned to the god of sulfur. Now may also be a good time to speak about the nature of the god of sulfur. We're told the sulfur god used to be a part of a more whole being, this of course being Ulmer, and Sylvian's attempt at creating a perfect human. We learn upon Sylvian's observation of humans born in her image, she learned that they were more obsessed with love for each other than love for their creator. Reproducing at a rampant rate, they would overpopulate the world and come into adversity with Nunush, Sylvian's very own child with Gorgoroth, and as previously discussed, nature itself, which may be an allegory for human advancement in production, outweighing and exploiting nature. Sylvian would conclude humans as they were could never show the love she showed them, and thus tasked her servant Vitruvia to create a perfect human, eventually creating Ulmer. Ulmer would garner great support and would eventually lead humanity against its corrupt kings, cleansing humanity's reputation, the process in which is inferred to have stained his own subconscious. However, Ulmer at some point would be captured and sentenced to death. His death would mark year zero on the calendar, as just like Jesus, eventually he would be reborn, but this time as a bona fide god on par with the old, the process of which would have him cast away his corruption and leave only his pure form. While the first game initially indicates the following years were guided by Ulmer's new influence as a pure god, we actually learn the portion of his subconscious left behind in what is referred to as the Sulphur Pits would actually come out on top and reappropriate Ulmer's worship to fuel himself, and the world from this point was actually guided by the Sulphur God, a pure epitome of humanity's worst excesses. Inadvertently, humans worshipping Ulmer were actually worshipping the Sulphur God, explaining why the world may have only gotten worse as the New World Order symbolised by Year Zero began. To return to Rontiel, we learn Perkele, privy to the Sulphur God's presence, was a cultist that sought the re-emergence of the Sulphur God's influence in a world where its influence waned in the creation of the God of Fear and Hunger, and thus this rare dimension was in fact a Sulphur God dimension brought upon by Perkele. This is further supported by the aesthetics of this dimension. It doesn't host the traits we would assume from Rare, as we know from the Lady of the Moon from Fear and Hunger 1 that Rare's dimension resembled the green hue typical to the old gods, whereas this dimension is wooden, dark, and deeply corrupted. It's thus more reasonable that the Rontiel were aspects of the Sulphur God's traits. The new gods tell us the Rontiel are an elusive creature that are told to have haunted the nightmares of people for eons, likely being present from the beginning of the Sulphur God's reign from Year Zero. As there are many of these beings found throughout Rare's dimension, it's unlikely they were great servants of the Sulphur God, such as the Lady of the Moon to the true Rare. However, as we encounter them in a dream dimension of the Sulphur God's realm, invoked by Perkele's use of a trace of Rare itself, they stand tall amongst the more regular corrupted enemies, smaller aspects of one of the most important, influential, and chaotic deities within the game. Born in Preheville, Levi's early childhood was dominated by mental health struggles due to an abusive relationship between his mother and father. One day this abuse would come to a boiling point where his father would take the life of his mother, something that would deeply scar Levi. His father, unable to take care of Levi, let alone care for the young boy's ailing mind, would eventually lose custody of him, the authorities assigning Levi to St. Domecq's orphanage. Growing up in the orphanage, Levi was privy to the mistreatment of his peers, and eventually he would be spared the mistreatment as the Eastern Union, who occupied Bohemia at the time, had conscripted every capable person they could in the war efforts against the Kaiser's Bremen army, including the children. During Levi's time in the military, he would take to guns quickly, becoming incredibly proficient with an array of rifles, pistols, and trench guns, eventually coming to command a battalion of his own. However, the presence of other child soldiers would build within Levi a deep resentment towards the Eastern Union, leading to Levi deserting the Eastern Union and travelling back to Preheville to lay low. When choosing to play as Levi, you're immediately met with an increased proficiency in guns, but also a status effect known as withdrawal. This indicates Levi's mental health was being haphazardly self-medicated with substance abuse, something that would haunt him through his time in Preheville. Levi admittedly is incredibly frail, despite his history as a captain. He suffers frequent panic attacks and potentially dies at the hands of Caligula if no intervention is made. He's also one of the early members of the train that can moonscorch, this of course playing into his already frail mind and susceptibility to the mind-altering effects of moonscorching itself. In a battle, as you'd expect, Levi is physically weak, unable to fight with conventional melee weaponry, and relies entirely on his rifle, which he admittedly is more proficient in than most other characters. However, despite this proficiency, his mental health struggles are far too present to not impact his own fighting capabilities, and of course this is best represented in his moonscorched form, known as the Weeping Scope. The name itself pronounces his two dominant traits, trauma and a rifle. Found in Preheville's west, he takes shot at Karen and Marina, and even us in the orphanage within Rare's dimension. But in a certain encounter, even as a moonscorched enemy, we can find the Weeping Scope having what seems to be a depressive episode, laying still and not aggroing the player, further playing into his anxiety even once he has transformed, and thus the notion that even as a monster, he suffers the disadvantages of his very human trauma. Despite half his moveset literally being him just crying, the other half is represented in his move known as Rapid Fire, indicating as a rifleman his transformation has actually made him something akin to a living turret, able to fire many bullets in succession, making him far more than just his title as the game's most proficient gunman. Ultimately, the combination of both of these things make him some of the weaker moonscorched contestants, but his marksmanship and cocooned form and literal turret in his face place him here on the list. The most curious element about the Bobbies are the fact that we can find a tape and witness an ordinary police officer of Preheville being forced into a transformation. While we don't know for certain who was responsible for the tape or the coughing of the police officer, all eyes do point towards the sulfur cultists in cahoots with Percolate and indicate the Bobbies, unlike say the half-cocooned, were intentionally chosen potentially even before the festival began to be official wardens of Preheville on behalf of the cult. It's thus no surprise the intentionality of the Bobbies' transformation means their bodies were specifically corrupted to be imposing threats within Preheville during the festival, which may explain the more full transformation when compared to their half-cocooned peers that are told to have only been partially mutated. This of course is further embellished by their most prominent feature, this being their aggressively rotating heads, once again an intentional feature used to ensure their resilience in the face of adversity, making their weak spot essentially untouchable, even from a gameplay perspective. We learned this more full cocooning has also made them near immortal, able to get up after being downed within seconds to continue mercilessly pursuing the contestants, carrying clubs in all arms. Yes, I say all because they have many limbs. They rank near the top of the ordinary hierarchy of threats coordinated by Percolate to make the Termina festival as harrowing as it has come to be known. As a Brit, this one's going to be hilarious to try to speak out loud, so bear with me while I try to get through this entry. Aside from Valkyrie's entry down the list, there are no clues, text or information relating to the Bellend outside of our fight encounter with it. However, there is some interesting stuff posed within Darn's medical examination. Darn tells us the creature has a sturdy shell-like exoskeleton. The skin, or the surface layer, feels like hardened leather that has been burned to a crisp, and it's in this description that we get the most proof as to what it actually is. We learn its skin is both burned out but also sturdy like a shell, both indications that the bellend is actually just a moon-scorched being, but particularly of the cocooned archetype, and may represent a variation of moon-scorched not dissimilar to the bobbies, inquisitors, and of course the half-cocooned. Darn on examination goes further, suggesting the bellend has come to the zenith of its transformation, immediately standing above the half-cocooned, and when compared to the bobbies, they may also still come out on top, as we learn the bobbies were still in a burned and blistered stage of their metamorphosis, whereas the bellend has developed an entire exoskeleton, which may also explain their much calmer demeanour and far greater coordination and agility. What the purpose of the bellend is actually quite a difficult thing to ascertain, as we don't ever get any details as to what kind of person or thing they used to be before cocooning. We do know they travel across buildings and hunt participants within the Termina festival though. Their weapon of choice is always an iron spear, something described as common for Old Bohemia's population. And as we know, those that follow the traditions of Old Bohemia in the modern day are the scattered Venushka worshippers in Prehevild's peripheries, there could be an argument made that these are the residents of the owl cult that have been exposed to Rare's light. Of course, their agility amongst rooftops pay extra credit to this too. Naturally, the abhorrent nature of Perkale's intentions as one aligned to Sulphur, a diametric opposite to Venushka, may have rendered their affiliations with Venushka entirely redundant. However, it is their more whole transformation in an archetype of moon-scorching, often related to turning beings into threats of the festival rather than victims, that places them above their contemporary, the Bobby. A victim of the Kaiser's days as a soldier during the early days of the First Great War, Pav would have his entire village demolished by the Kaiser, with his family and relatives all killed. Marking a turning point in his life, he would conjure a ruse with the ultimate goal of killing the Kaiser. The first step was to join the Bremen army. Pav would do just that and rise the ranks quite quickly, achieving a lieutenant rank and the trust of the Bremen army. While never brought close enough to enact his vengeance in his life before Termina, he would observe the Kaiser's obsession with Prehevil, and after the Second Great War, he knew he could find the Kaiser in Prehevil. Upon the train being brought to a halt, he would quickly leave the others and head straight towards finding the Kaiser on a self-destructive campaign for vengeance. This campaign can end in many ways, enough ways in fact that Pav doesn't ever get a Moonscorch transformation, as his mission always ends in tragedy, arguably the most tragic being an event where Pav will finally confront the Kaiser in front of the Hollow Tower, only to be instantly brought down and bleeding out on the pavement. There is a scenario where Pav can kill Marco and Tanaka, but this scene clearly shows Pav may have taken advantage of both while they were unaware of his intentions. What's interesting with Pav is that we know he's a lieutenant, but we also know his peers, the Bremen elite soldiers, as we'll discuss down the list, are physically enhanced to operate as something akin to super soldiers, something Pav clearly is not, suggesting his rank may have come from trust rather than his ability to fight. This isn't to say Pav is harmless, however, as he is clearly incredibly efficient with a pistol, taking down Marco and Tanaka with single shots to the head, both fast and precise, something we ourselves can witness when we engage in a fight with him, where he quick draws his pistol and begins the fight with a quick shot to the player, drawing Pav's distinction as a marksman, sharing similar equivalents to Levi, but without the inherent baggage of an anxious and trauma-riddled mind. Pav isn't the sneaky type either, making his way through Prehevil with malicious intent, choosing the loudest and most confrontational route, indicating unlike others who make it through the days of the festival and even through Prehevil and to the Hollow Tower, Pav did so by taking down the inevitable threats we ourselves could face too. These merits combine to make a distinctly strong character, but as we never get a Moonscorched variant, lesser than some of the other more exaggerated traits of his contestant peers. Throughout the narration of both games, we're told Ninush, the god of nature born of Sylvian and Gorgoroth, didn't necessarily take a single form or even ever depicted as a single form. The new gods tell us that different regions of the world had very different depictions of the god, as she was the concept of nature itself, and nature represented itself differently in different regions, and so did her worship and imagery. In Fear and Hunger 1, we aren't even given the ability to worship the god, as we learn the world had steered heavily away from nature, and Rondon in particular had placed their worship deeply in what they believed to be Ulmer, who was, in fact, the sulphur god. However, in the events of Fear and Hunger 2, and since Ulmer's declining influence, the worship of Ninush, now known as Venushka, had reclaimed a spot amongst the pantheon of old gods and ascended gods. We know this through Enki's writing within the Venushka Skin Bible. The power of such worship is best seen through the owl cultists. Found throughout the deep woods, it's no surprise Venushka's followers had claimed the forests as their base of operations. While the cultists in physique are nothing of note, it's their ability to conjure upon an owl sprite, a guardian of nature and thus an aspect of Venushka herself, that makes them particularly dangerous. We don't get direct notes on the strength of this owl sprite, but we do know Venushka in contemporary times carried as much influence as the other gods. It's implied Venushka's re-emergence has a lot to do with a growing band of worshippers seeking the preservation of nature over human production. The owl cultists, at least in Bohemia, a place enshrouded by war and technological advancements, and even the ire of the Bremen Empire, were able to preserve the deep woods to a point in which it is almost entirely isolated from the collateral of war. All clues for this preservation point towards the owl cultists, laying claim over this land despite the variety of contentious and belligerent factions that occupy its peripheries. As we learn from the Death Mask entry, Old Bohemia were a deeply nature-driven people, and the owl cultists may have been an anti-colonial entity that emerged amongst the old residents in reaction to the belligerence of its surrounding nations, looking to take advantage of their natural surroundings for technological advancement. It's thus reasonable to assume the power of the owl sprites were either deemed far too troublesome to trespass or greater than even the expansionist tendencies of factions such as the Bremen Empire, testament to how they were able to retain the culture of Old Bohemia in a modern setting where it would become the hotbed for a majority of the great conflicts in the history of the game, placing them firmly as one of the most resilient and powerful beings, blessed by an old god herself. Inquisitors are an interesting entry, as while they take on the cocoon archetype of moon-scorched beings rather than the flayed disfigurement relevant to the old town, they don't rely on their physically imposing mutations, rather they rely on their affinity to the gods. In conversation, they identify themselves as the judiciary for Preheville's religious bureaucracy. As we learn, Preheville in modern times was a deeply theocratic nation, having built a great church to Ulmer and centering his image in their religious ideals. However, the Church of Ulmer that stood at the centre of Preheville was actually run by a cohort of dark priests that carried on the old, outdated tradition of polytheistically revering the old gods. Naturally, due to the international stigma attached to such archaic practices, these priests often operated in secrecy, and in Preheville they drew influence by secretly portraying their holy site as one that worshipped Ulmer, but beneath the church was a bastardized version of Ulmer, likely invoking Ulmer's great opposite, the sulphur god, and reaffirming the dark priest's secretive hold over the territory, which may also explain why Perkele was able to take control of Preheville too, but more on Perkele for his respective entry. Nevertheless, we learn the Inquisitors may have originally acted as Preheville's judiciary before the Termina festival, as they can call upon the city's police at a moment's notice to apprehend and confront those they deem guilty. Naturally, as we learned from the Bobby's entry, the police force of Preheville were directly mutated by the sulphur cultists to act as threats within the Termina festival to invoke further suffering, and whether the Inquisitors got the same treatment is not entirely clear, but we do know they too would take on a similar form due to being moon-scorched, becoming cocooned and calloused, and able to coordinate this new corrupted police force as equally corrupted judges. Despite lacking in offensive capabilities when compared to their police contemporaries, what gives the Inquisitors the edge is their clear connection to the secretive cabal of Dark Priests. In our battle, they can utilize a wide array of blood magic, invoking Gorgoroth's power, able to use Black Smog, and even hurting, typical for Dark Priests from the first game. Just like the first game, the invocation of Gorgoroth is an incredibly powerful thing, as he was in fact the god of destruction and thus by proxy, his powers extremely destructive even amongst his divine peers. However, within the hierarchy of Dark Priesthood, we know the Inquisitors may rank lower based on the existence of bona fide Dark Priests that carry the true traditions from the first game, such as that of Saint-Marie, Father Hugo, and even the Decrepit Priests. We learn Henrique hails from the primary setting of the first game, Rondon. In Rondon, Henrique had a knack for the culinary arts, with dreams of grandeur and an ego that screamed self-conscious. Eventually he would dip his toes in a variety of disciplines until he would eventually flourish as a cook in his parents' tavern as a last resort. Fortunately for Henrique, his talent would come with great commercial success, enough so that his parents' tavern would become world-renowned for their dishes. Riding on the coattails of the tavern's success, he would embrace his talent and travel to various regions of the world to bring home new dishes, which of course would lead him to Preheville. Very early on, Henrique can both be taken out by Caligura, or more likely Moonscorch as early as day 1 within the Mayor's Manor. Taking the form of the gentleman, Henrique's Moonscorched form is represented as a hulking, grotesque beast, clad in formal attire. As we know, moonscorching often reveals one's most prominent traits, whether hidden or not. Henrique's form is symbolic of his constant ploy for affirmation and recognition, and as you'd expect, this is accompanied by a dangerously fragile ego, raging at the player if you call out his facade. However, the benefit to us is that Henrique as the gentleman is uniquely the most initially friendly Moonscorch victims in the entire game. Greeting us as he assumes the de facto position as the mayor of Preheville, he invites us to dinner and with strategic wordplay will even let us be on our way with a literal key to the city. If called out, however, he fights us. In this battle, he relinquishes all formalities and bears his hulking size to turn us into his next meal. Trivially enough, his primary weapons are a giant knife and a giant fork. While benign in their regular form, the giant form essentially act as spears. And while Darn does not have any specific observations about his physique, from sprites alone, the gentleman shares a design not dissimilar to some of the much larger enemies in the game, such as the upcoming Shogna, and even eclipses lesser Moonscorched beings such as the neighbours. As his skills suggest an entirely physical moveset, his size makes him formidable on this merit alone. The moonscorching to his skin clearly taking on the less torturous and flayed archetype, and instead cocooning his larger muscular body with a stronger shell, strong enough to rank here on the list. As another example of the brutal techniques employed by the Church of Ulmer in Preheville, we have the Pillarmen. While details of their origins are not given to us, we do know they serve the primary function of being tied to the rafters of the church and forced to cry gospels as they suffered in agony. As we learn, the Church of Ulmer was a facade, relying on Ulmer's imagery to legitimize their authority in Preheville. Governed in secrecy by a cabal of dark priests within the church, it's not surprising such brutal methods would be employed to maintain the church's image to the populace. One of the key themes of Ulmer is, of course, sacrifice, or death at the stake, not dissimilar to the crucifixion of Jesus in Christianity. However, upon examination of the Pillarman's body, Don comments that the being, despite spending a majority of its life on the rafters, has somehow been able to accrue so much muscle that it's literally protruding out of its skin, and has an unexplained anvil-like skull. When we try to beat the body, we get a unique dialogue indicating its skin is like pure muscle and you're unable to change a thing. It's important to stress Dawn's medical diagnosis and even the beat feature are seldom biased and often give crucial factual insights into the physiology of a being. No other enemy in the game is given the physical credit of both Dawn and the in-game text like the Pillarman. This credit, of course, also lends itself to its perceived weaknesses, or should I say lack thereof, being outright told there are no physical weaknesses at all in the Pillarman by Dawn's medical examination. Fittingly, they rely entirely on their physical strength to beat us down, when encountered literally bulldozing and tackling us with all of their body mass. When it comes to physical strength alone, only few come close to the Pillarmen. However, the major caveat, of course, is their lack of sanity or intelligence. It's clear the years of torment they had to endure has rendered them entirely speechless and akin to raging bulls, and thus, while physically more imposing than some that may come after, rank firmly here as a titan in strength alone. The story of Stitches and the living flesh are tied intimately with the character and great serial killer hunter that stalks the contestants known as Needles, a man with a deep history not only with Stitches but also with Dawn. If we choose to play as Dawn, we're made aware of Needles resembling his father-in-law, Ina von Dutch, originally a doctor who looked towards Sylvian and particularly her healing traits as a means of practicing unconventional medical procedures. We learn Dawn may even credit his medical knowledge to his father-in-law. However, at some point Dawn would be conscripted to participate in the Second World War, and upon his return to his father-in-law's manor, he would learn von Dutch had either been taken hostage by sulfur cultists or developed a deep fascination with the occult, in particular the sulfur god, going on to ritually sacrifice himself and his daughter in its name, and being reborn as sulfur cultists and bearing its insignia on their faces. This ritual would cause a rebirth within Von Dutch and his daughter Elise, eventually coming to be known as Needle and Stitches, a brutal father-daughter duo and pure vessels for the will of the sulfur god. Naturally, upon this rebirth, they would both become privy to the existence of the most ambitious sulfur cultist ever, a man who had in his control the traces of an old god ready to converge the realms of sulfur with the material world too, leading Needles and his daughter to leave for Preheville. While we'll speak more on Ina von Dutch during the Needles entry, we learn Elise, now known as Stitches, would settle within the darker corners of Preheville, and as previously discussed, be noted in the creation of Sojobs. However, Sojobs were not her only creation, as this battle also includes a being known as Living Flesh, a being described by medical diagnosis as particularly weak and extremely non-functional as a living organism. A keen distinction between the description of the Sojob described as extremely impressive. This distinction may actually relate to a similar trope employed in the first game related to the human Hydra, where there is a diminishing returns to being fused under a Sylvian marriage, and the living flesh may teeter much closer to excessive fusion. Sylvian marriages are of course important to bring up, as it's made clear Stitch's previous worship of Sylvian under her father's tutelage may be responsible for the living fusion organisms she was able to create. However, the existence of the living flesh and its nature does give us clues as to what purpose she served under Perkale's cult. As we know, the removal of limbs are typical of the sulfur god's worship, and with such an excess of sacrificed limbs, it's made clear through her channeling of restorative powers, specifically loving whispers, that she reappropriated her pre-existing affinity to Sylvian to create new life, not unlike what we come to expect of Sylvian marriages in the first game, only this time with more physical stitching. This also suggests that unlike her father, Stitches may have been seen as useful to Perkale not as a brutal killer to increase the threat and anxiety of the Termina festival, rather as a summoner, someone to crowd Preheville in abominations made in the sulfur god's name, with the excess of limbs used to invoke his presence within the town itself. Within the battle, she relies entirely on jabbing us with needles and her own otherworldly powers exclusively aligned to healing. As she can use the spell Loving Whispers, it's worth noting that she may have uniquely been the greatest practitioner of these otherworldly powers too. This, combined with the inseparable living flesh, turns a particularly weak entity into a far more dynamic threat and a duo worth landing here on the list. Born at the heart of the Bremen Empire as a twin, we learn Olivia and her sister Rayla were birthed at the strike of midnight and thus technically on separate days. This is relevant as we learn both would thus harbour unique birth signs. Olivia was born with the shadowed soul and Rayla was born with the radiating soul. They were polar opposites. Star signs and astrology in general are important themes in Fear and Hunger as everyone has an inherent soul, some more pronounced than others, but all due to live their lives under somewhat predetermined paths. Olivia in her youth would unfortunately fall victim to a series of strokes that would eventually have her bound to a wheelchair for the foreseeable future, whereas Rayla was outgoing, a social butterfly, leaving Olivia to often spend her days indoors, headfirst in books. Olivia would eventually build a fascination and great knowledge around botany, and Rayla matched Olivia's academic strengths but in engineering. Both sisters relied on each other as they lived under a harsh conservative household, as their parents were staunchly religious and often dismissive of science itself. Olivia and Rayla would eventually both succeed in winning a spot at the prestigious Bremen University, offering an avenue for both to formally leave home and pursue their careers without the scrutiny of their parents. Olivia would excel in natural sciences and be elevated to a position of prestige within the university, even looking after Bremen's biggest greenhouse. On the other hand, Rayla would also succeed, but the nature of her work remained mysterious even to Olivia, with assurances she was working on a project that would do good by humanity. Many months would go by and eventually Olivia would learn that Rayla, out on one of her projects, had been proclaimed a traitor to the Bremen Empire and sent to prison. However, soon after, a group known as the NLU, more on the NLU for Abella's entry, would break her free. Following the thread, Olivia would learn of Rayla's correspondence between a professor and her mission to undo a operation in Preheville, and this was all Olivia needed to pack her things and head to Preheville herself. We'll pick up Rayla's story much later down the line, but as you'd expect, Olivia is an extremely frail character. As a human, she can either use attacks that are literally labelled flimsy or revert to toxic mists produced through her knowledge in botany. And her journey through the festival requires aid from a variety of people, notably the procurement of a wheelchair. However, upon moonscorching, she transforms into what we know as the mechanical dance, a far more formidable foe. Aesthetically, the mechanical dance might be the most interesting transformation, as unlike her peers, she takes on a form that is more machine than human, this form of moonscorching unseen in the entire game, confusing even Abella and Dan. Of course, we know this may be due to her wheelchair being bound to her transformation and morphing around her as she scorched. We can engage in a dialogue with Olivia where she is incredibly self-deprecating, outlining her true feelings about having to live in the shadows of her more able-bodied sister. As a battle, she has 2 long blades for arms and is able to let out toxic from her vents, calling back to her botanical roots. Thus far, we know moonscorching often adopted one's most prevalent trait. It's a weird one with Olivia, as her form doesn't necessarily, at least in combat, relate too heavily to this concept, her form and fighting style not inherently linked to botany entirely, or even the concept of always being in the peripheries of her sister's life. Olivia isn't told to be a weapon wielder, so the blades don't necessarily make as much sense as, say, Levi as the Weeping Scope, and thus with the mechanical dance we have to go off of the basics. The mechanical dance is a large robotic being with blades that, according to her attacks, can quite quickly dismember limbs. She has very little vulnerability, suggesting her body is as equally, or more likely far more resilient than the cocooning archetype. Her blades, one of a few attacks, almost guaranteed to dismember limbs, making them stand out as particularly dangerous too. Her size, judging from her sprite, is massive too, potentially bigger than the gentleman. And so with the combination of these things, She ranks here on the list, a difficult entry to place for sure, but a great way to set the scene for a later, more complex entry. As the first enemy we encounter in the game, the janitor, not unlike Rontiel, is associated to Percale and the sulfur dimension created by his use of Rare's traces. However, unlike the Rontiel, there are clues to suggest the janitor used to be a peer to Percale himself. The primary theory actually comes from his name. While janitor is a weird name for a being we meet within the sulfur dimension, tasked with keeping slaves in line and creating cubes for reasons not made entirely clear, we learn the name may actually come from his previous role within Prehevil itself. The primary purpose of the mold apartments, we learn, is that it acts as a physical gateway between the sulfur dimension and the real world. How this came to be is suggested to be related to sacrifices made in the sulfur god's name, and the apartments being a hub for these sacrifices. While we can't know for certain who or how many people were responsible for turning the apartments into a gateway, all things actually point towards the janitor as the primary suspect. We know the white mold apartments have a large custodial closet and basement, but more importantly, he is the only clearly sentient and seemingly non-moon-scorched and human-like beings in the sulfur dimension, bar Percale and the other moon-scorched participants such as Levi and Tanaka, who are suggested to have entered the realm in a means not unlike us in the white mold apartments. Other theories even suggest Percale may have been the landlord for the white mold apartments and the janitor was his cultist peer that commanded the sacrifices of people to open up a pathway to the sulfur god's dimension. His proximity to Percale, an almost godlike deity, seldom keen on affiliates, suggests he may be one of the more powerful sulfur cultists. However, unlike Percale, he doesn't command any otherworldly powers associated to either the hijacking of Rare's traces or even the sulfur god himself. Despite this, the credit that he was the potential architect for conjuring so many sacrifices, it literally opened a gateway to hell, does indicate the sheer brutality the janitor was capable of, and no doubt proximity to the sulfur god's dimension and Percale may have caused great enrichment when taking a peek at the lore itself, standing tall as one of the greater enemies in Termina. Tanaka, a non-playable contestant, is told to come from the east. It's implied he hails from the kingdom of Edo. Edo is an important part of Tanaka's identity, as behind his businessy appearance, he holds a potential for greatness, a greatness Marco recognizes, but also a greatness built into the fabric of the culture he comes from. Since the events of Fear and Hunger 1, Edo has softened quite a bit. Edo was once a great kingdom that neighboured the Eastern Sanctuaries during Nasra's reign as the Sultan. We're told Edo held deep anti-colonial sentiments towards the belligerents of both Nasra and the Eastern Sanctuary. This would boil over into a variety of great wars between both nations, where Edo was able to strike a stalemate with the Eastern Sanctuaries many times over. While unfruitful for the Eastern Sanctuaries, we do know the few prisoners of war that had been captured from Edo ended up catching the admiration of Nasra. Eventually, he would reappropriate these criminals and turn them into great warriors for the Eastern Sanctuaries, creating some of the greatest swordsmen in the continent, known as Jizamurais. While Edo has changed since these days, seemingly leaving its warrior past behind them, pivoting their exceptional skills into more diplomatic means, they would eventually rise as a mercantile nation known for great businessmen throughout the world. Tanaka comes from one of these great business families, and his trip to Prehevil, as you'd guess, a ploy to take advantage of the turbulence in Bohemia for his own financial benefit. Throughout our interactions, he is polite and seems to defy the ruthless businessman archetype the Edoans had become known for, Marco even going on to see within Tanaka not business acumen, but a lineage of great warriors, offering to train Tanaka in the way of physical combat, something Tanaka takes well to. And if we avoid the million different ways Tanaka can die prior to Marco's training, we learn Tanaka is able to become a great warrior, relieving himself of his business jacket and hat and assuming a bandana to signify he has manifested what it truly means to be Edoan. Marco, impressed by Tanaka's training and the bond that they would build, would eventually go on supply runs until they would unfortunately find their way into the White Mold apartments and the gateway to the Sulphur Dimension itself. Marco, consumed by the corruption, eventually moonscorching into the giant, would leave Tanaka to fend for himself, something he clearly was able to do, making his way further into the Sulphur Dimension. If encountered and fought here, we are given further evidence of Tanaka's great transformation, as in this battle he uniquely has greater stats and even new skills such as an array of jabs akin to Marco's fighting style, suggesting adjacency to even Marco after having been mentored. Eventually, however, Tanaka does succumb to moonscorching, turning into the Judgment. Judgment is a super interesting entry as there is a large amount of symbolism in both his attacks and aesthetics that indicate he has truly come to encapsulate more than he was ever intended to be. One of his primary attacks is known as glass ceiling, a term often used to refer to an invisible hard limit for someone's progression in either their career or development. The shattered glass on his head suggesting he broke this so-called limit, no doubt linked to Marco's training, forcing him to assume his ancestral lineage as a great fighting champion. However, it's hard to suggest Judgment is greater than his contemporary Marco as the Giant, as upon examination of his body, Dan suggests the state of his body was nearing death due to the endless self-inflicted torment required for Tanaka to reach the heights that he has, thus carrying the history of Edo all on his own, and the training of Marco combined with his form as a master of his own limits, he ranks a peg below his mentor. Born and raised in the narrow streets of the Vatican, a place often touted as the holy capital of all Mers worship, but deep set with occultism and poverty, Marco remembers his early life as beside his parents that would one day vanish. Left an orphan with just his little sister, he would quickly take to petty crime in the streets of the Vatican to make ends meet. As he grew older, the streets would begin to respect Marco as his adulthood would be marked with great strength and a physically imposing stature. Marco's infamy grew alongside his reputation, and many street gangs would seek to hire Marco as their own muscle. Choosing against being involved with organised crime, Marco would eventually learn his great asset was never his knowledge in petty crime, rather his brute strength, something he eventually capitalised on in underground fighting tournaments. These tournaments would eventually lead to capturing the eye of an infamous mob family within the Vatican, something he couldn't avoid as his sister, now an adult, had found herself romantically involved with one of their main men, Riccardo. Initially, the mob was nice to Marco, and while they too invited him to join their ranks, Marco refused, eventually coming to a middle ground where Riccardo proposed Marco take his boxing to the next level, sponsoring his efforts to make it to the professional arena. Reluctantly accepting this offer, Marco began his professional career, winning fight after fight until he was due to fight a boxer who had recently left the mob. Riccardo, finally revealing the nature of his altruism, urged Marco to murder this man in the ring, something Marco would indeed do, as Riccardo would leverage the life of his sister if he didn't comply. After murdering this man in the ring, Marco was overburdened with guilt, and despite keeping these feelings in check, Riccardo would only use this event as a means to leverage his sister further, asking of Marco to act out more violent crimes in the mob's name. Marco, unable to live his life this way, would eventually confront Riccardo, eventually killing him and rushing to rescue his sister before news spread, now on the run from both the Vatican police and Riccardo's mob family. His sister would call him and let him know that she had left for Varland and could escape to London to rendezvous with her brother to start their new life elsewhere. Taking the first train to a place where he could gather his thoughts, he would set off for a small town in Bohemia, eventually taking the train to Preheville, and exactly where we meet him in the main game. Marco proves to be a kind figure, not dissimilar to Abella. He's one of the few contestants that avoids moonscorching all the way to the final day, no doubt testament to his ability to fight. We know he stands tall as one of the most imposing contestants, and even goes as far as to potentially teach Tanaka how to fight, ultimately turning Tanaka into a champion worthy of his Edoan lineage. However, on day 3, on a supposed supply run, he would eventually find himself at the epicenter of Preheville's corruption, this of course being the White Mold Apartments, eventually moonscorching himself, transforming into a being not dissimilar to the neighbours, but much greater in size, great enough that he would adopt the moniker the Giant. As with all Moonscorch victims, moonscorching often brought out the most prevalent trait of its victim, and as we know, Marco is by far the most capable of the contestants, having a history of reigning as a boxing champion and even single-handedly fending off the mob in his own story. He would transform into a mass of muscle with large limbs, able to flurry these limbs with ease, as if their mutations did not weigh him down at all. From the Neighbours entry too, we know those that transform from moonscorching this close to the Gates of Sulphur itself are likely to inhibit more twisted and potent forms. With Marco's most prevalent trait being his strength, it's no doubt that he is one of the most physically strong moonscorch contestants in the game. As discussed in the Soldier's entry, we learned the Bremen army led by the Kaiser were a belligerent faction that sweep through Bohemia under the ideology of unification under the Bremen flag. We learned their success against the Eastern Union were large-scale and potentially some of the most successful projects of Lebensraum in centuries, mostly due to the fact that at their head was a secret new god, but more on the Yellow King for his own entry. But beside the Yellow King were his soldiers, and we learned they too stuck out as extremely advanced when compared to their peers. On inspection of an elite soldier, Dahn suggests the reason they were so powerful may have something to do with advancements in biological enhancements, likening them to unholy Bremen experiments. Essentially, the Bremen army had bred super soldiers. Whether this was through Sylvian marriages, as will be explored in the Sylvian Troopers entry, or good old-fashioned chemical enhancements is unclear, but all play into their superhuman distinction. Their success over the Eastern Union is nothing to be scoffed at either. As we learn, the Eastern Union, while a new nation to the world of Fear and Hunger 2, were actually an alliance between the incredibly powerful nations of the Eastern Sanctuaries, the Veronian Republic, the Great Rondon itself, and even Oldegard, all immensely powerful entities and respective hegemons of their own eras. The Eastern Sanctuaries boasting the lasting impact of Nasrar's great era as a war-hungry sultan, Rondon the centre of knowledge and imperial expansion on a scale unmatched in the series, and Oldegard a large region of clans known to produce champions so great they single-handedly took on the land of Vinland, plagued by monsters akin to those found in the dungeons of Fear and Hunger. Yet despite this, the Bremen Empire swept the Eastern Union. So devastating was their campaign, they forced the Eastern Union to conscript literal children due to their military casualties, and eventually concede on the Bremen Empire's total demands, one of which being, of course, the annexation of Bohemia, and in particular, Preheville. While we'll speak on the events of the Kaiser in Preheville in more detail for a later entry, we do know at the spear end of this campaign were the elite troopers of the Bremen army, and likely the most imposing military during this period of the game. Carrying large rifles in one arm, usually intended for both, and a huge shield in the other, they are incredibly imposing figures, and in our battle demonstrate immense military training with their rifles, and the ability to destroy bones with ease from just their brute strength. However, we do know the Bremen army were more than just their elite guards. They had large numbers, advanced military technology, and of course a literal new guard at the head of operations. And thus it would be disingenuous to suggest the elite guards had everything to do with the Bremen success. However, they do represent the Bremen army's exemplary military strength in contrast to their contemporaries, and stand firmly here on the list above the other superhuman type enemies, as the elite soldiers are both sane and trained to be war machines. The Flame Trooper is basically a joint entry with the Elite Trooper, so if you skip that entry, this entry will be void of any context. But to keep it short, the difference between the Flame Trooper and Elite Trooper is told to just relate to their armaments, this of course being a flamethrower. We're told on inspection they are identical to the elite troopers in physique, but uniquely can only be found within the White Bunker, suggesting the Kaiser may have deemed them particularly more valuable as defensive assets to the protection of logic, and thus rank a singular peg, or more likely, on par with the elite trooper. For this entry, I need you all to put your speculation hats on, because even the creator of the game refers to the Gullbros as sort of just manifesting themselves in the game through the right of memes. However, what we can say for certain is that the Gullbros are without a doubt a homage to Captain Rudimer, or more specifically the Crow Mauler from Fear and Hunger 1. We learn the Crow Mauler used to be the captain of the guards that oversaw the Rondonian dungeons of Fear and Hunger, appointed to the station for his merit as a fierce knight in a tradition filled to the brim with great warriors. Captain Rudimer would eventually find himself lost to the same corrupting force of the God of the Depths as his own men. We know the God of the Depths carries many motifs, but most importantly to his motifs were that of scavengers, explaining insects but also explaining avian traits associated with its corruption. However, by the events of Termina, we know the God of the Depths has long since been replaced by the God of Fear and Hunger, a synthesis of the world's new conditions that did away with the relevance of the God of the Depths, and in its place a God of human struggle and perseverance. What makes things more confusing is that upon examination of the Gullbro's corpse, we learn Darn can't diagnose the Gullbro's form, removing any doubt of the gull head being a mask, but also affirming that it has no relation to the corrupting nature of the Moonscorching either. So how does a homage to a now century-old phenomenon find its way into Preheville seemingly with no influence from Rare's Light, and how are the Gullbros just sort of accepted into Prehevillian society? The answer is convoluted, but may actually play into the story related to the beekeepers previously mentioned on the list, particularly the re-emergence of the God of the Depths' influence in pockets of Bohemia due to the God of Fear and Hunger's relevance waning since the inception of the Cruel Age after the events of the first game. Of course, we know these conditions are changing as the God of Fear and Hunger has since found itself on par with the older gods. This also explains why the Gullbros may be far from the power we would assume for the Crow Mauler, as the Crow Mauler was transformed in the heart of the God of the Depths, while the Gullbros may have been transformed through worshipping the old deity all the way in Bohemia, not unlike the beekeepers. However, this isn't to say they're not powerful in their own right. We know they are one of a few beings within Preheville that are openly out in the world and have yet to feel an ounce of moonscorching, assuming they were in fact deemed worthy to be contestants during the festivities, or alternatively were able to ward off the influence of Rare through their worship of the God of the Depths. In a battle, they carry all the hallmarks we can expect of the Crow Mauler, even carrying the same weapon known as the Mauler and able to peck the head off any of their adversaries in a single move. However, the lack of clarity on their origins combined with their history and adjacency to the Crow Mauler firmly place them here on the list, with the caveat that this may change drastically if a Termina update does indeed drop. As mentioned in the Inquisitor's entry, Preheville, while holding something of a political bureaucracy overseen by the mayor of the town, was actually under the control of the Church of Ulmer in a more theocratic fashion. Incidentally, the church itself was run by a secret cabal of dark priests who used Ulmer's image as a means to establish themselves in Preheville without rousing suspicion on their less than holy position as polytheists still beholden to the gods of antiquity. The church would become a centre point of Preheville and large swathes of resources funnel to the church itself, enough so that it would become one of the most prominent domains for traditional dark priests since their dissolution through the ages, outside of the primary domain in the Vatican. We even know one of the most well-renowned dark priests known as Father Hugo, but also Father Demek, would use Preheville as their main permanent residence, producing literature that the Vatican would publish more widely. Thus, beneath Father Hugo and Demek were the great dark priests, with an almost indispensable amount of resources and space to continue to uncover the art of the old gods, becoming extremely proficient in the process. The Dark Priest would also hold influence over ordinary people in Prehevil too, able to impose Prehevil's monopoly of power in the police force through the use of inquisitors, to control schools, and even the ability to experiment and displace civilians at their own will, something the wretched being complains about to us directly. This also means the decrepit priests were some of the most talented dark priests in the entire game, and despite the tradition of dark priesthood having declined over the ages, they may stand even taller than the usual discipline spoken of during Fear and Hunger 1. However, the Dark Priesthood's reign over Prehevil would come to an abrupt end when it would invoke the ire of a group of fanatics aligned to the Cult of Sulphur, this of course being Perkele and his band of occultists. And as Perkele began to shine the traces of the old god Rare upon the city, the Dark Priests quickly sought to leave Prehevil but were too late. They too had become corrupted by moonscorching. We know they did try to leave, as Father Hugo can be found having packed his bags before becoming moonscorched himself and unable to leave, which is the same case for the other priests too, leading us to the decrepit priests themselves. While the decrepit priests are ordinary dark priests by Prehevil standards, they were far more than ordinary in the discipline as a whole, and once corrupted by the Moonscorch, it would twist their will where they would laser focus on the study and practice of Gorgoroth to inflict as much torment as possible in accordance with the will of the Sulphur God. While Dark Priests, especially in the first game, are told to be frail and relying upon blood magic alone to eliminate foes, we learn the Decrepit Priests combine both an incredibly resilient and imposing body alongside an expert level of blood magic. This may be due to their mix of pre-existing godly affinities and the moonscorching having calloused their bodies not dissimilar to the cocooned enemies, further evidenced by Darn's medical examination. Once again, it's worth affirming how immensely powerful blood magic is in this game. We know Nasra single-handedly ruled over an entire block of the game's geography with just its power, and thus the Decrepit Priests soar above many of their peers, a true evolution from an age-old tradition, embellished further by the traces of a god they once revered themselves. As yet another unplayable contestant that joins us during the Termina festival, we learn Samari is intimately linked to another contestant known as Marina. We'll go into Marina's story for her respective entry, but what we do need to know here is that Samari was one of Marina's more quiet classmates during her scholarship in the Vatican. In Prehevil, Samari follows Marina, even stalking her in her sleep. We can also find a unique cutscene where Samari enters the Church of Volmer and kills Father Domek, who of course is Marina's father. While this may indicate Samari is stronger than Father Domek, the cutscene does show Samari surprising Father Domek with a stab to the abdomen, rather than a formal fight where both participants use their respective strength in spellcasting. So it doesn't necessarily mean she was more powerful than Father Domek himself, something relevant as we move into Father Hugo's entry. After murdering Father Domek, she in a panic will flee to the basement of the church and travel into Rare's dimension through a ritual circle. Here we can usher her back to the train, and eventually she speaks about her time in the Vatican and her involvement with something known as the Ninth Circle, a brutal ritual created by the Ministry of Dark to torture some of the gifted kids and offer their life force to commune with the old gods. It's inferred Samari would gain great godly affinity due to these experiments, but her life would be cut short by many years. However, as a side effect, she has unique abilities able to teleport through red arcs, and what is presumed to be greater mind reading and blood magic too. In our fight against the ordinary Samari, she strikes us as a deeply anxious and uncoordinated threat, but can utilise typical blood magic such as hurting and Venushka invocations such as pyromancy trick. However, if met in front of the Flesh Pillar, our encounter with her has her transforming into Dysmorphia and her true Moonscorched form. Dysmorphia is an interesting name as it does fit well into Samari's traits, as we know she had little self-esteem of her own due to the trauma the Vatican inflicted upon her, and channeled much of her own self-image through Marina, and in her final form these identity issues culminate into the monster we know as Dysmorphia. While dysmorphia as a battle in gameplay isn't too different to the fight with Samari herself, we do know she, not unlike an ordinary decrepit priest, had the same formal training but was also enhanced deeply by her participation in the Ninth Circle rituals at the Vatican. While this isn't represented too well in the gameplay as unique fighting abilities, we do know from a lore perspective this gave her a variety of unique ways of channeling the old gods, far more unique than what we could expect for the decrepit priests. This may also explain her ability to summon ghouls linked to necromancy and thus a heightened affinity to the god of destruction, Gorgoroth. As Fear and Hunger's version of a genie, the Poe, as you'd expect, can really only fulfill one wish, a brutal and sadistic death. Initially introduced to us by Dr. Keffer, he refers to the being as something that should best be forgotten and not to be meddled with, which indicates it may actually be a being that has been around for longer than the corrupting nature of the Termina festival, unrelated to these events. If Marina is in the party, she tells us the basement associated with the Poe may have been a place of worship, something the worshippers may not have even wanted the church to know about. This otherworldly aspect to them is also reinforced by the game as we can't harm them with physical abilities. While we don't know what deity they served, we do know the word Po is likely based on Po from Chinese mythology, referring to a spirit that often lingers amongst the corpses of the dead. We know Prahaville throughout its history, from belligerent nations that took advantage of its resources to the Church of Ulmer secretly experimenting on its civilians, and even Perkele sending many of its inhabitants to ritual slaughter for the sulphur god, was a place of mass death, and thus it's not surprising a being of this nature would manifest throughout the area. We don't know for certain what deity it serves, with clues it could be related to the Ascended Gods based on a certain area we can meet them, where a perfect ritual circle is available, but all things do point to this creature being far from human, and may have, as others of similar standing, come from the green hue, potentially even symbolising the concept of grief itself, not dissimilar to the Chinese legend. We know concepts are represented as material forces in Fear and Hunger, and much like the White Angel from Fear and Hunger 1 representing grudges, Poes may represent grief. Able to kill us with a singular attack, literally manhandling the player and throwing them around the room, there is no doubt Poe is a being of mythical power, on par with some direct servants of deities adjacent to the old gods. However, the lack of information does leave room for speculation, and thus, conservatively, Poe ranks here on the list. From a theorised aspect of a servant of an old god to a bona fide living embodiment of two, we of course are speaking of the Crimson Father. If anything represents Perkele's synthesis of the Moon God and the Sulphur God, it is without a doubt the Crimson Father that takes this position. Creator of the series Miro gave details on the origins of the Crimson Father as being related to an extensive bloodbath or slaughter, something akin to snails emerging after rainfall. We know Prahaville would become a hotbed of ritual murders, from the early experiments of the Eastern Union to the stranglehold levied by the Dark Priest that ran the Church of Ulmer, and even Perkele's rule over Prahaville as a grounds of sacrifice to the Sulphur God. It's not surprising such a creature would emerge, but the question stands: who does it serve and where does it source its power? In dialogue, we learn the Crimson Father holds a bottomless green in its eyes. Of course, green is no coincidence, as we learn the green hue is consistently referred to as the birthplace of the old gods, the primordial soup that would create beings such as Sylvian and even Gorgoroth. Why this is relevant may actually have to do with Perkele's invocation of the moon god Re. We know amongst all old gods, the green hue is often associated most with the moon god Re. We even know the Lady of the Moon, a bona fide servant of Re from the first game, is able to travel back and forth from the green hue on command. Furthermore, we know the Crimson Father is able to telepathically communicate with the player, sending us visions not unlike the Lady of the Moon but also the Menaba. However, what's most curious is that the visions it grants us are actually visions of the Sulphur God, something made most apparent as we are told of a one-eyed god and visions of torn flesh. This suggests the Crimson Father may be a combination of Perkale's use of the traces of Rare to invoke the strength of the Sulphur God, a missionary of sulphur born from the traces of an old god. This is precisely why Dan refers to them as otherworldly, as without a doubt this being isn't human but rather a true servant of both deities born from the same green hue as the old gods. This symbiosis is also best represented in combat, able to use Menaba-like attacks such as tentacles and mind control, while also viciously carrying an occult dagger, playing into the occultishness of Perkale's secret cabal. It's impossible, of course, to leave out the clear imagery of Cthulhu invoked by the Crimson Father's design, something that may be more than just a callback, as it may also be indicative of one of its greatest strengths, this of course being the ability to warp the mind of a human through eldritch knowledge. One of the dialogue options literally stating, "You see faint visions of an unknown god, a god that does not belong to this world, a god that never belonged. Its shape does not make sense even as a feeble vision." We see this similar trope being employed by Gorgoroth in the first game, where he disintegrates our mind by opening us to the greater scheme of the world. Paying further credit to the Crimson Father's capability, something drawn closer, as we do know it carries a weapon not dissimilar to one of Gorgoroth's closest allies, the Black Witch from the first game. While this isn't to say the Crimson Father is a servant to Gorgoroth, it does reaffirm their place as a true being from the green hue, a direct servant of the gods, likely initially as a servant to Rare, only to be controlled by Perkale as a servant to the Sulphur God. Many beings rely on the use of otherworldly powers, or the divine invocation of gods through worship to impose their will onto the world. However, the Crimson Father, born native to the green hue, is in itself otherworldly, and thus its ability to project the power of both Rare and the Sulphur God far greater than most others. We do, however, know the Crimson Fathers are a naturally occurring phenomenon, with many of them throughout Preheville, and may in fact be a smaller aspect of a greater hive mind. Unlike the other obstacles of the Termina festival, Needles isn't a moon-scorched individual, rather he's in fact a sulphur cultist with a detailed backstory. Of course, this relates entirely to the previously spoken of story for Stitches, as Needles is, in fact, Einar von Dutch, Dan's father-in-law, and the unfortunate victim of a brutal sulphur god ritual. If you missed Stitch's entry, I do urge you to go back for more context around Needles' backstory, but in any case, after arriving in Preheville having assumed the form of a sulphur cultist, he would quickly acquaint himself with Perkale and become an integral part of the Termina festival, obsessed with hunting down participants and single-handedly beheading them in its darkest corners. Amongst all other enemies, Needles proves to be the most relentless and malicious of the entire festival. If not dealt with early, he will single-handedly kill every single participant. While we can only watch him actively take out Tanaka, we know after a special death animation, he will let us live only for us to find every single participant dead, brutally murdered one by Needles, of course bar the unbeatable Great August. Venturing through the game after this event, we can find Osar dismembered, Marina's face separated from her body, and the others sadistically murdered, suggesting in the lore alone Needles is far stronger than every other human contestant in their pre-Moon Scorch form. Of course, again, this doesn't include August. Why Needles is so powerful relates entirely to how dynamic of a killer he is, repurposing his unmatched understanding of medical sciences and Sylvian into chemical warfare, taking advantage of a variety of mystery fluids. On medical examination, we're told he is misleadingly muscular and his body almost entirely resistant to absolutely everything, something we get a glimpse of based on his reaction to literally being shot and laughing in the player's face. This enhanced body shows no signs of being affected by Moonscorch, and is most likely related to his own choice to pump himself with steroids and other physically enhancing drugs, using his expertise in chemistry through Sylvian and his knowledge in medicine. There's also a plausible theory that the ritual of the Sulphur God where he sacrificed his own body may also be related to his enhanced physical form too. This fuses together to really justify him as the boogeyman of the game, relentlessly stalking players and proving directly he has the ability to mercilessly slaughter each individual participant. placing him far above many others on the list and proving himself to be second only to Perkele as the most dangerous sulfur cultist, directly empowered by the same force that would give Perkele a platform to transcend from human into a deity of his own, a being powerful enough to take control of a trace of an old god. As a lesser version of this, but great in adjacency and evidently far more corrupted by the touch of the sulfur god than his daughter, as we know he was the one to invoke the ritual in the first place, he ranks here on the list, stronger than even Osar, the most capable, playable participant, and a prodigy of Nosra himself. More on Osar for his respective entry as the mastermind. As one of the more distinctly unique Moonscorched contestants, Abella, an older guardian by birth, was born early enough to have her childhood clouded by war. Having witnessed the impact of the First Great War and the restorative efforts of her town, she quickly took to engineering to offer what she could to these restorative efforts, but also her services to a potential further impending war brewing between the Eastern Union and the Bremen Empire. As the threat of another war became more present and many men were being drafted to serve on the front line against the overwhelming power of the Bremen Empire under the Kaiser, Abella was burdened by the guilt of not being able to stand beside them, as by this point in her early adulthood, she had already made a name for herself as an incredible engineer and a necessary asset to the home front away from the front line. However, on one particular night on her way home from work, she had encountered a wounded man running towards her, asking for her help. Taking the man in and nursing him to health, he would slowly recover and ask her to be recruited to the Nameless Liberty Underground, or NLU for short. The NLU worked across Europa, claiming neutrality against both the Eastern Union and the Bremen Empire, seeking only the dismantlement of advanced technologies that posed an existential threat to humanity. Requesting of Abella to return to Rondon and the NLU's base of operations with his documented findings, Abella would set out and find herself in the company of the NLU. The NLU took fondly to Abella and divulged information about the Eastern Union, developing a scientific project that had the capacity to change the world forever. Fearing most the Bremen Empire's annexation of the territory, and thus the tool and the power they would hold with it in their possession. This was likely made worse by the reputation of the new dictatorial leader of the Bremen Empire, and on the eve of the Bremen Empire's occupation of Bohemia, the NLU had to act fast. Abella encouraging her new colleagues to act swiftly and dismantle this new technology, the NLU chose instead to play it slow, something that didn't sit right with Abella, causing her to leave for Bohemia alone to uncover the mystery and put to end this existential threat they were yet to truly understand. This is precisely where we meet Abella on the first train to Breheville beside the other contestants here on a specific mission. Of course, just like her peers, Perkele would have other thoughts, instead plunging all contestants into the Termina festival. Amongst her peers, Abella stands out as one of the earlier Moonscorched contestants. If we aren't playing her and if we visit Henrique, she inevitably Moonscorches during her mission through the tunnels. In her Moonscorched form, she transforms into Shogna and single-handedly one of the most powerful and imposing Moonscorched enemies in the entire game. Donning a male physique and an elephant's visage, her form likely plays into the idea that she didn't fit into the gendered category she was forced to inhabit, eagerly wanting to join the war efforts only to be left behind to maintain Oldegard at home. As mentioned, Moonscorching often brings forth one's most inherent traits, and within Abella is born a hulking beast and a trumpet able to collapse one's head if blown on more than once, revealing that within Abella was a power far greater than the men who went to war before her. As one of the few Moonscorched contestants able to instantly murder you without even a coin flip attack, and her attacks all sharing the giant prefix to indicate her hulking size, the lore makes clear Abella as Shogna is an incredibly unique and powerful Moonscorched contestant. The environmental clues make abundantly clear that Shogna may be far stronger than even Marco as the giant, as she can literally burst through iron walls like butter, and when we include her huge eldritch horn, able to explode heads with just the decibels it produces, as if it was some kind of eldritch trumpet of the end times, Abella as Shogna ranks here on the list. If you missed the Decrepit Priest entry, I urge you to go back for the majority of context in Power for Father Hugo, as he is in every way a decrepit priest, but with a few extra caveats. Father Hugo's primary distinction amongst his peers is that he was extremely well known in the realm of occultism for his leadership and breakthrough discoveries within the occult, going on to publish works such as the God Manifesto. How he came to such knowledge is indicated to relate to his natural-born talent, but also his fascination with Mahabharata. It's indicated he would visit Mahabharata through a dream through the use of an ancient text known as the Passages of Mahabharata. We aren't told what he would do during his time there, but it's inferred this is where he would gain an incredible amount of knowledge, likely having visited the Grand Libraries as his first stop, as would any good dark priest. His fascination with ancient literature would even have him in the possession of an unaltered version of the Skin Bible, in other words, Enki's own writing. Enki by this point had become without a doubt the most enlightened individual when it came to the nature of the world, and his unaltered books immensely useful to someone looking to invoke the divine powers of the old gods too. With this knowledge, he would climb the Dark Priest tradition, find himself at the top of Praheville's church, and even given full control over St. Demec's orphanage. Outside of his office are the symbols of Gorgoroth and Sylvian, suggesting he paid very close mind to the two most ancient old gods. Gorgoroth in particular being important as the most lethal spells came from his divine invocation, something we get to witness when we face off against Father Hugo within the orphanage. This battle, while seemingly identical to the Decrepit Priest fights, turns out to be far more unique as, unsurprisingly, he's able to channel and use a variety of god affinity spells no other priest is able to conjure, such as Scorched Earth from Venushka and an array of blood magic too. While the difficulty of the game doesn't make the distinction well enough, his life as one of the greatest dark priests and being the only living character in Termina, beside literally Lagarde as the Kaiser and the charred head of Nasra, that has canonically been graced by the knowledge of the gods he drew his power from in Mahabharata, puts him far above his peers, and here on the list. Assigned male at birth, Marina is one of two contestants that were born native to Praheville. Born into the great Dark Priest Demec's lineage, her father was at the head of the Dark Priest cabal that secretly ran the Church of Ulmer. Marina's mother, uninvolved with the Dark Priest, knew the nature of occultism was brutal, especially to a young boy, and thus raised Marina as a girl through her early life to avoid enrollment into the Dark Priesthood. Eventually, having been raised quite orthodox and away from the church, she would, despite being steered away from the Dark Priests, have her talents as an occultist become pronounced early in her life, and as she grew into a talented young woman, her work even recognised by the primary body of occultists in the world, the Ministry of Darkness within the Vatican itself. Convincing Marina to join the Vatican, she would be granted a scholarship and the first train out of Praheville, something she took willingly, and despite having now left Praheville, she remained one of the Dalds and chose to continue living as a woman. Her time in the Vatican would be met with critical success, refining her abilities in occultism during her tenure, literally being told she had acquired lifetimes worth of practice in a few years. Her talent so great, even Samarie would find herself obsessive over Marina and her work. Within the game, this lifetime's practice is best seen in her repertoire, able to use powerful spells such as Black Smog, Flesh Puppetry, but most importantly, and only distinct to Marina alone, being the spell called Engrave, a mastery of occultism that allowed her to channel any of the old gods from Gorgoroth all the way to the god of fear and hunger. This immediately represents Marina as soaring above not only her Dark Priest peers, but potentially in line with some of the most world-renowned and fully grown adult Dark Priests we can already meet in the series. We also know, much like Marco, she is one of a few contestants that can make it all the way to the Day 3 night, bar an event with Needles, suggesting aside from a targeted campaign by Needles to kill her, she would make it further than most participants purely on her own merit, no doubt linked intimately with her proficiency in spellcasting. On the third night, if we make it to the Church of Ulmer, we can find Marina having taken the form of the Cocoon, a form she assumes that exaggerates her most prominent trait, her occultism and roots in divine invocation. In this form, she takes her occultism to a level not even remotely close to any other dark priest or occultist, able to use blood magic at the highest degree such as the use of Black Orb and Hurting, Venushka to the highest degree through Pyromancy Trick and Roots That Reap, and the God of Fear and Hunger to the highest degree through Flesh Puppetry and Mischief of Rats. It's no surprise that she's able to use all of these spells, as we finally get to see how her lifetime's worth of critical distinction in the Vatican has enriched her, and further symbolism as to why she is the only character able to even learn Engrave, representing this multidisciplinary mastery. As a final point, there are solid theories that suggest the figure that's strapped to her back may actually be her father, the immensely powerful Dark Priest, Father Demek, which explains her jump in Divine Invocation, but also why her back actually has its own ability to utilise blood magic linked to Gorgoroth, as we learn her father was a world-renowned blood magic practitioner himself, someone often pronounced a senior to even Father Hugo, essentially making this a fusion entry ranking firmly above a majority of others in the game, and above Father Hugo too. Born into wealth within the Bremen Empire, Karin's childhood was pretty typical outside of a rebellious streak. Unfortunately, as the Kaiser came to power, her family's lineage would put her in the crosshairs of growing racial bigotry, and her mother would entrust a nursemaid to take Karin out of the Bremen Empire and to the relative safety of Jataya in the historic Eastern Sanctuaries, now known as the Eastern Union. In Jataya, Karin would be forced to reckon with a wealth inequality her privilege had since made her blind to. This would build within Karin a longing for social justice, eventually getting involved with organised protests. However, at one of these protests, she would be knocked unconscious and eventually deported by the Bremen embassy back to the Bremen Empire. Finding the country now under the control of the Kaiser and with her father dead, she vowed to use her time to undermine the Kaiser, suspecting he was more than human, and rather a new god seeking to control the world under a human guise. While not physically imposing, she had a good track record of agitation through protests and organised movements, and thus chose to live her life as a war journalist, casting her magnifying glass on the Kaiser and the Bremen Empire. During this period, she would write many notable works, but never gathered the traction she needed to undermine the reigning authority. However, after the events of the Second World War and the nature of the Bremen Empire's concession after annexing Bohemia, her gut feeling told her the Kaiser was up to something far greater than expanding the Bremen's borders. This gut feeling would have her travel to Preheville, the epicenter of the Kaiser's campaign, to unravel the mystery once and for all. This is where we meet / are able to play her. On her individual merits alone, she's more than anything a great war journalist, often believing the job title to be a good thing, seeing herself as a Valkyrie despite claims of vulturism. Equipped with a pistol and a book, nothing states that she's a great shot like Levi, and her physical abilities are limited to a frantic tackle as a last-ditch attempt to subdue her adversaries. Eventually and inevitably, of course, Karin will Moonscorch. But her Moonscorched form is far more powerful than her usual form, and why this is has everything to do with who she was. In her Moonscorched form, she becomes what is known to us as the Valkyrie, a play on her own distinction between the rhetoric of journalists being vultures and her own belief that they were in fact more noble and self-sacrificing. This form sort of resembles both, as she is both Valkyrie and Vulture in aesthetics. However, this isn't even her most prominent trait, as the thing that sticks out most is of course the pack of bellends she carries on her back, able to hurl masses of spears onto you in coordination. While seemingly out of place, her dialogue tells us that she will immortalise those that have fallen and perished, and she will ensure they will live forever, playing into her past as a civil rights agitator. Karin is always good-intentioned. While her agitations were met with great failures, she always took the first opportunity to put herself in harm's way, to organise and megaphone the voices of those that were less privileged than her. Her Moonscorched form is an embodiment of this trait, literally carrying on her back lesser beings and standing face first against the harm that would be inflicted upon them. And for her efforts is gifted with the mass organised efforts of lesser beings, combining their individually weak force into one great revolutionary movement. In her sprite, we can count at least 6 bellends on her back. saying Bellends is never ever not going to be hilarious, which would by all metrics make her as powerful as the sum of her parts. However, this entry is not just 6 combined Bellends, rather they are enriched further by the evasion of flight and the hive coordination of her own eye. This combined effort is represented as an unblockable mass of spears, unblockable of course because she can take whatever angle she pleases with the benefit of flying. For all intents and purposes, the Valkyrie is a war machine and Karen's final wish to act as a Valkyrie for the less fortunate, a revolution on wings eclipsing many of her peers. Much like Stitches and her living flesh, the Sylvian Trooper is an inseparable enemy to the platoon, and thus the encounter is a joint entry. Building on the context and credit of the Bremen army spoken of during the Elite Trooper entry, we have the highest ranking Bremen soldier, bar only the Kaiser himself. Not unlike her trooper peers, the Sylvian Trooper is one of a few of Kaiser's soldiers that are keenly aware of his ultimate goal in usurping the machine logic. Found near the Kaiser's own location, they act alongside the platoon as his personal bodyguards. The most interesting aspect of the Sylvian Trooper is of course its physical form. Unlike the Elite Troopers, the Sylvian Trooper is clearly more than just a chemical enhancement. In fact, our biggest clue to its uncanny human form is actually in its name. The old god Sylvian, as we learn, is best known as the god of love and creation, humanity owing both its rapid population increase and even its creation to Sylvian, as humans were once created in her image alone. While Sylvian's departure from the world meant her presence has declined, we do know many worshippers of Sylvian would maintain their allegiance to the old god through the extreme act of Sylvian marriages, a fusing of flesh between 2 consenting beings, eventually fusing both organisms into one, often more powerful being. This may explain why the Sylvian Trooper herself takes on such a peculiar form, as we do know these abominable marriages often did lead to peculiar mutations. Upon examination of her body, Dawn tells us the outfit does reveal the muscular physique of a person. There is something uncanny about her proportions, going further to suggest her body has not been tainted by any means of moonscorching, lending further credit to her form being totally due to a Sylvian marriage. As we find the Sylvian Trooper between us and the Kaiser, it's likely too that the Kaiser personally appointed the Sylvian Trooper as his personal guard, which also explains why the Sylvian Trooper not only knows of the machine logic, but also understands its end goal, the eradication of the individual human mind. We know this as she proclaims her aggression towards us as a last-ditch attempt at a thrill ride, suggesting we're already too late to try to put to stop the activation of logic. Kaiser and the Bremen army were incredibly hierarchical in nature, and it's not surprising a robust Sylvian marriage, alongside another great heap of fused humans in the platoon, stand beside us and the Kaiser. In a battle, she leans into her bondage archetype, whipping and bleeding us to death. There aren't many cases of true Sylvian marriages in Fear and Hunger 2, and as we know, Sylvian marriages often produce the greater aspects of its participants, with the caveat of diminishing returns, as is the case for the platoon. The Sylvian Trooper, second only to the Kaiser in commanding the Bremen army, ranks as its greatest soldier. However, beside her, she is also accompanied by the fleshy tank. Much like the Sylvian Trooper, this being is clearly a callback to Sylvian marriages, but more importantly, a callback to the human Hydra. While this may be hard to believe, as the human Hydra was a docile, sad mutation of a bunch of gods invoked by a mass Sylvian ritual, it's clear the Bremen army actually found a means to take advantage of such an organic mess. How we know this is the case is that upon closer inspection, it's clear the platoon is a conglomeration of flesh, as it hosts a variety of faces embedded throughout the being. Of course, its connection to the Sylvian Trooper is just another affirmation as to its Sylvian influence. With the platoon, it seems the Kaiser, or alternatively the Sylvian Trooper, was able to take advantage of it by sticking a cannon to its visage and using it as an organic tank, a weapon of war, and much like an ordinary tank, it's clear the platoon has very little sentience and ability to navigate itself on its own, and this is precisely why the Sylvian Trooper is ranked beside the platoon, as she is in many ways its pilot. When coordinated, it poses one of the most dangerous attacks in the entire game, a literal slugshot mortar at close range right to your face. While the platoon would, on its own merit, rank much lower due to its uncoordination, as is the case for the human Hydra, the dynamism as a fight fought together makes for one of the most deadly threats in the entire game. Their dynamism, no doubt, one of the Kaiser's main trump cards and reasons for his wide-range success on the battlefield during the Second World War. In this moment, we go face first with the Kaiser's most important weapon of war, and what seems to be a one-of-a-kind weapon he may have deployed in the most crucial battles during the Second Great War, where the Bremen Empire essentially swept all neighbouring powerhouse nations, forcing the world to acknowledge their unipolar hegemony. As one of the 14 contestants, August is one of the non-playable contestants that joins the others as they make their way through the events of Termina. Unlike many others, however, August always intended to make it to Preheville. Why this is relates entirely to his heritage, as despite residing in Varland, he was actually born in Oldegard, and his heritage suggests he is the descendant of none other than the immensely powerful Ragnarvalda from Fear and Hunger 1. Our biggest clue amongst the more subtle details is of course his unique interaction with the Moonless fight. In this battle, August will quickly come between us and Moonless, suggesting Moonless has been in his family for ages, asking us to spare its life. While Moonless's story is for later in the list, we know Moonless is of course the same Moonless from Fear and Hunger 1, the wolf that would find itself in the company of Ragnarvalda as they traversed and eventually overcame the dungeons, returning home to fight that same corruption in Vinland. We know Moonless would outlive Ragnarvalda partly due to the corruption of the God of the Depths having seeped its way into its skin through the blade known as miasma, which explains why August knows the wolf well as a family pet, and how he is tied to Ragnarvalda's lineage. Unlike a majority of other contestants, August is in Preheville with a purpose. He's here to confront Kaiser, who he knows as Lagarde and the leader of the Midnight Sun that once slaughtered many of his own ancestors during the events of the first game. In Preheville, he's without a doubt the most adept at surviving on his own, and can be seen jumping over gates of the city with great agility, swiftly making his way through Preheville entirely unharmed. There's even an instance where he can follow the player all the way to the White Bunker to confront Lagarde, taking a shot immediately only to be brought down by the Kaiser in retaliation. August never succumbs to the Moonscorching in the traditional sense, as he almost always makes it to the final night, and before scorching he self-deletes. We also know from his interaction with Karen that he's been spying on the other participants and logging his findings. Why this is may be a variety of things, but we know in a certain sequence he single-handedly kills Tanaka and suggests the impending consequences of Moonscorching has pushed him to accept the Termina Festival and partake in the Battle Royale. We also know Tanaka was not his only victim, as it's also inferred that Osar would also lose a battle to August. The clue, of course, relating to an event where we can meet Osar in the tunnels, where he has been struck by a glowing arrow, a signature attack from none other than August himself. While I don't want to spoil Osar's entry, we know amongst all contestants when it came to channeling purely destructive spells, Osar came first. His history rich with feats even Enki from the first game could not match. August's clear win over Osar no doubt suggests his descendancy from Ragnarvalda was not just a status symbol. In a fight, we learn how he was able to get through the events of the game so easily, as he is a spitting image of Ragnarvalda himself, a champion who'd earned the moniker as a god of ultraviolence, and of course reign as one of the most successful humans to ever combat the influence of the God of the Depths. His likeness to Ragnarvalda is unquestionable. His success in Preheville as a human is near unmatched. His ability to defeat Tanaka, Osar, the Bremen elites and highly advanced Moonscorched, and being the only other contestant to follow us to the White Bunker, likely triumphing over a majority of the threats we ourselves would have to fight through, as we can literally witness him one-shotting half cocoons, instantly eviscerating Karen when confronted, and literally within hours on the first last day of the festival, making his way through to the White Bunker to finally confront the Kaiser, all suggest August is immensely powerful and the events of Termina just an inconvenience to his true mission to kill a new god. And despite dying to the Great Yellow King, August carried arrows that Osar suggests are imbued with an essence that made them incredibly effective against otherworldly elements, making it clear August came prepared and believed he had everything he needed to truly kill a god. This may also explain why Nasra is immediately weary of August, as he no doubt senses Ragnarvalder's lineage. As the only contestant in the game who has personally experienced the true dungeons of Fear and Hunger, Osar is one of the most detailed and interesting characters in the entire game. Born in the continent of Abyssonia, a place with a much deeper and rich history of human civilization. While historically isolated from Europa's own continental wars, Abyssonia was not averse to internal conflicts too, something that would build a deep apathy within Osar as he saw the conflicts as no more than petty rivalries over age-old deities. Osar's feelings of apathy would reach a tipping point when Abyssonia would be plunged into a conflict with Europa. Not looking to die over geographical lines and Europa's belligerence, Osar would leave his homeland and set his sights on Amon, a place far from the contested borders between Abyssonia and Europa, and far enough to give Osar the time he needed to hone his greatest asset, his mind. It wasn't long until Amon's primary academic body, the Temple of Amon, would accept Osar into their ranks, and it took less time for Osar to clear their entire syllabus, mastering their teachings on all primary ascended and old deities. While for most polytheists this would mark a great step in their spirituality, Osar had the opposite reaction. After learning what he could, he understood religion as nothing more than an opiating medicine for the masses, a social superstructure that legitimized nothing more than a class of ruling bureaucrats. Without realizing, Osar was actually priming himself to become something more than just a polytheistic scholar or occultist priest. He was showing signs of a much older tradition, a tradition first brought alive through a new god so powerful he oversaw one of the longest dominant streaks in the game's history, this of course being Nasra and his Yellow Mages. In no time at all, Osar would eventually stumble upon an old scroll within Amon's library, a scroll that spoke of an age-old tradition consisting of mages that didn't worship gods but took advantage of them for their own gain, reveling in the chaos one could conjure through their invocation. Travelling to the historic eastern sanctuaries, Osar would be surprised to find the Yellow Mage tradition had since been rendered a taboo subject. Society had progressed past their selfish stranglehold over the country. Osar, however, was loud and abashed about seeking out the Yellow Mages, and eventually a small band of Yellow Mages still functioning in the world would find Osar, recruiting him into their ranks. They saw within Osar a nihilism to match their great old leader Nasra and potential to further his studies and influence in the modern world. Much like the Temple of Amon, Osar took quickly to the tradition, learning the infamous Danse Macabre and affinity to blood magic once put in place by Nasra. Eventually, Osar's distinction would have him in the company of a man named Hadil Azif, a man with a long lineage dating back to the heyday of the Yellow Mages. Hadil, recognizing Osar's power, would recruit him on a special mission to the long-since forgotten dungeons of Fear and Hunger, an old sacred site all great Yellow Mages would go to enrich their understanding of the power of gods. On this journey, only Osar would make it to the dungeons. Having outlasted his peers, he ventured in, and learned the dungeons remained as perilous as they were in the sacred texts. Osar, a well-seasoned Yellow Mage and master of a variety of great blood magic, would fight his way through just as we had in the first game, gathering the texts of Enki known as the Skin Bibles, and eventually finding within the rubble the murmurs of a man. This man, of course, the legendary terror of the world, Nasra. Despite Nasrar's abrasive introduction, he took well to Osar, seeing within him the progress of a tradition he once started, a yellow mage worthy to be his own pupil. Nasrar would urge Osar to travel to Prahvil to confront a man who once did him wrong. This man, of course, none other than the Yellow King, Lagard. Osar, while selfish, knew there was much to learn from the greatest mage ever, and travelled to Prahvil, Nasrar's head in tow. In Prahvil, Osar is, as you'd imagine, dismissive and condescending to everyone, and easily finds his way through Prahvil, even finding time to meditate in random spots, as if the urgency of the festival was nothing to him. We even know he makes it to the final night, all on his own. In a battle with normal Osar, he carries the hallmarks of the Yellow Mages from the first game. He's able to channel the affinity of Gorgoroth in a similar sense, and even cast overworld damage to the player on approach. No other character can do this, which again reminds us that the Yellow Mages were grades ahead of the religious Dark Priests, no doubt due to their apathy towards morality and extreme selfishness in their pursuit of power. In this mode, having proven himself as not only being the greatest of the Yellow Mages and a worthy pupil to Nasrar, having already experienced and overcome the dungeons of fear and hunger, all on his own, and even enriched his own mind with Enki's work on the very gods he drew his strength from, Osar was already greater than the fame-driven Vatican charlatans and the Dark Priests of Prahvil. However, this isn't where it ends, as we know Osar can indeed moonscorch in the final night in what is assumed to be due to apathy towards Perkele's Festival of Termina, rather than being defeated by the festival's monsters. In his moonscorched state, he assumes the form known as the Mastermind. While there are little details about the nature of his transformation, we do know the name the Mastermind is an exaggeration of Osar's primary and potentially only trait, his selfish pursuit of knowledge. It's clear his mind, having gathered ancient knowledge far beyond any other being, has caused his brain to take a life of its own, seemingly parasitically taking a hold of his body and able to regrow limbs at a whim. He has, at this point, become more than just a physical being. He is an embodiment of magic supplemented by the history of a scholar that puts even the most talented Dark Priests to shame, and once again affirming the Yellow Mages when it comes to the invocation of gods as an offensive tool stands second to no one. The Mastermind in this moment is literal magic incarnate, not unlike the head of a god of chaos sitting comfortably in his backpack. Proof that Nasrar, even in his debilitated form, still holds great influence in this world, embellishing Osar's own prodigal journey to realizing himself as the most powerful Yellow Mage. From the one piece of lore context related to Rancid, we learn they hail from the land of Vinland. While Vinland is a mostly mysterious part of the world, known for being a section of the world related to the Old World Order, we get more context from the New Gods, which explains the continent had developed far before the advent of new gods and humanity's hegemony in the world. It was a part of the world that was native to the old gods and ancient deities before they had formally left the planet. We know civilizations roamed the earth far before humans had been conceived by Sylvian and Vitruvia, specifically civilizations linked to the lizard people, and while we have thus only heard of remnants of scattered lizard people in the Rondonian dungeons of Fear and Hunger and the historical place they had in Mahabra, we never get to see where the lizard people truly originated from, as we are told they pre-existed Mahabra and all other sentient beings in the game. There is even indication they pre-existed the old gods' influence on the world itself, and they were discovered by the old gods as a sort of primordial race on Earth rather than the other way around. Leading us perfectly to Vinland, a place so contentious to life itself that humanity is yet to charter the region, even during the contemporary events of Fear and Hunger 2. However, the existence of Rancid the Circle actually points towards Vinland being the homeland of the lizard people themselves, and may have been the primary area of the world the old gods had first introduced themselves, and later built mutual structures in society with the lizard people. Rancid the Circle aesthetically is without a doubt lizard-like, something confirmed when unmasked. In his dialogue we also get clear contention when we speak of its race as animalistic, only for him to jab back at us and refer to us as hairless apes, a derogatory term not unlike what we can expect from what we know of the lizard people from the first game, the only other distinct race to hold deep antagonisms towards humanity. While it's initially suggested that the lizard people all migrated to Mahabharata to be close to the gods that descended from above, the circle spear indicates a race of lizard people may have remained within Vinland even after Mahabharata's creation, indicating a divergence in a culture we initially assumed were entirely homogeneous. The divergence would also explain why the Sergal are lizard-like but not exactly similar to the lizard people from the first game, as the conditions of Vinland, specifically after the old gods had left the world or left for Mahabharata, had become extremely desolate. So desolate, in fact, it was only after Ragnarvalda's company sailing for the land was the area ever even mapped in modern history. Ragnarvalda, however, made clear even if humanity could not exist in these conditions, Vinland had become home to a variety of horrific creatures, likely linked to the large traces of the old gods still being present in Vinland more than anywhere else, potentially even more so than the dungeons of Fear and Hunger as well. The existence of these traces meant a great deal of otherworldly monsters would find a home here, Ragnarvalda suggesting that the God of the Depths' influence within the dungeons is only but a microcosm of what he experienced within Vinland, which also explains why the Cube of the Depths were first found in Vinland too. Ragnarvalda, of course, would eventually leave Vinland after obtaining the relic, but we're told the Sergals learned to persevere and would eventually form a warrior tribe to the north of Vinland to claim the territory as their own. Rancid the Sergal is not just one of these great warriors, but potentially their version of Ragnarvalda, except he's his antithesis, a being born in Vinland, travelling to the world of humans, reigning as much terror as he could. He's, in this sense, Vinland's god of ultra-violence. A title he seems to live true by, as he can literally be seen soaring through Preheville and decimating enemies en masse, like an unstoppable killing machine doing it for the love of the sport alone, proving the claim that he may have conquered every danger in Vinland and started travelling the world to test his unkillable streak with as many others as possible. While gameplay doesn't affect this video, the context that Rancid has some of the most varied attacks in the game further reinforces how powerful the Sergal tribe of Vinland were, and further explanation as to why they are the only civilization of recorded history to have existed in Vinland for generations, a place so incredibly dangerous not even the belligerents of the Kaiser, Rondon, Eastern Sanctuary, Eastern Union, and even Nasra would even remotely seek to conquer, placing Sergal as its greatest living representation, and without a doubt, one of the most powerful threats in this game. As a final point, on our second encounter we find Rancid having clearly killed the Iki Torso. While the nature of the Iki Torso is near impossible to ascertain, outside of its association with nature and thus Venushka, Sergal does refer to it as a half-god. The credit of this claim purely down to speculation, but we do know Iki Torso is godly in stature and aesthetics, potentially a bona fide servant to the god Venushka, ultimately painting Rancid the Sergal as a force far beyond what ordinary humans could ever come close to being, making him a peer to deities rather than ordinary humans. As everyone's favourite girl, Moonless makes a return in Fear and Hunger 2 as an absolute bona fide badass. To recap the first video, Moonless descends from a cohort of cave wolves, but would quickly be isolated from the pack due to a keen distinction in power and in strength. Moonless would eventually find herself wandering the dungeons of Fear and Hunger, and while we can kill her or pick her up as an ally in the game, we do know in the true canon events it's in fact Ragnarvalda that finds Moonless and allies with her as he makes his way through the dungeon. We know Ragnarvalda's canon story is without a doubt the most drenched in achievements during his time in the Rondonian dungeon. In fact, he would make it out alive and assume a role not dissimilar to the one we can witness during the God of Ultraviolence ending. However, beside him too was Moonless. Upon returning from the dungeon and making his way to Oldegard, it's indicated Moonless would also follow, and as Ragnarvalda set off for Vinland to destroy the aspects of corruption that had entrenched their presence there, Moonless was by his side. While there is a huge time skip between both games, on our encounter with Moonless we get evidence of both Ragnarvalda's immense achievements after the events of the first game, but also Moonless's achievements alongside him. In our fight with her, she has clearly been pierced by a variety of weapons, most notably the miasma, but also the Eastern Sword. Miasma in particular is interesting as it's a weapon of legendary origin, told to be one of a kind and a pure byproduct of the God of the Depths' corruption, suggesting Moonless braved the dungeons and may have defeated a great champion that wielded this weapon against her. We also know the Eastern Sword is relative to the Spectre Assassin, another legendary warrior from the Kingdom of Edo, a warrior class so great even Nasra, the great sultan of the Eastern Sanctuaries, sought to employ them to his own military after witnessing their valiant anti-colonial efforts. And while in the first game we have to go by her current standing, in Termina we finally get to battle Moonless after she has been battle hardened and reigned supreme alongside Ragnarvalda as champions of violence, seemingly destroying a great deal of Vinland and the dungeons of Fear and Hunger's influence after the events of the first game. In this battle, she has clearly become much greater in size. Darn suggests this may be due to the fact that miasma has been burned into her skin, something that has ironically transferred it a great deal of corruption related to the God of the Depths. This is further reinforced by the fact that she can utilize a spell known as Miasma Cloud, causing toxic damage to the player, becoming both a great champion who destroyed many aspects of the God of the Depths' corruption, but also a vector for its power too. We know the darkening corruption of the God of the Depths is able to cause tremendous power shifts, turning Rudimer into the Crow Mauler, ordinary guards into hulking beasts, and even a little girl into a true ascended god. We know August has a close affinity to Moonless, and as discussed earlier, may be related to his heritage to Ragnarvalda, and Moonless's rise to a position as a great protective deity in Oldegard. The adjacency to Ragnarvalda's legacy and her deep corruption also suggests Moonless was beside Ragnarvalda as he decimated Vinland after the events of the first game, making her, alongside Ragnarvalda, one of the few beings to challenge the chaos of Vinland and prove herself as greater than a part of the world so harmful it remains under the fog of uncertainty in most of the world's maps. Carrying Ragnarvalda's legacy and successes, the power of miasma, and the experience of a legendary warrior that has persisted far beyond even Ragnarvalda's life, living for centuries by channeling the force of the God of the Depths, Moonless ranks here on the list. In a lot of ways, Darn is very different to his contemporaries. As we learn, he doesn't moonscorch in the typical way, rather his body is taken over by a being so powerful it was created by an old god many ages ago, potentially even before humans dominated Earth, this of course being Pocket Cat. Born in Rondon, Darn was birthed into a long line of Sylvian worshippers. However, when he was 13, his parents would indulge in a Sylvian ritual that would leave him orphaned for good. Eventually, he found tutelage under Baron Einar von Dutch. If you want details on Baron Einar, because you missed the Needle's entry, I urge you to go back for more context. His time under Einar would have him take advantage of his proximity to Sylvian in his early life, becoming a doctor under the mentorship of Einar, who was already a well-renowned doctor himself. During this period, his life was stable as he was now married to Einar's daughter Elise and had a budding career as a great medic and healer himself. However, one day Darn would be conscripted to join Rondon's efforts during the Second World War. Leaving home, he would serve as a field medic and gain great knowledge of the human body, having experienced all forms of injuries due to the Bremen Empire's brutal military tactics. However, Rondon would be one of the first nations to withdraw from the war prior to its conclusion. This withdrawal would have Darn travel back to Rondon early, only to find his wife and father-in-law dead in a basement. After learning of a town known as Preheville and its potential influence on the death of his family, he would leave for Preheville, taking the first train there. This is where we meet Darn. He's a great character that can help diagnose conditions and medically examine corpses. His knowledge of the human body even allowing him to precisely strike enemies to critically wound them with his scalpels. He's a useful asset for the contestants in more ways than one. Despite his value, Darn is quick to journey off on his own but remains incredibly caring, suggesting his role as a doctor, while never having taken the Hippocratic Oath, binds him to helping the less fortunate if the opportunity arises. In a battle, Darn, as mentioned earlier, is great with a blade. He's one of a few characters able to deal the critical state status, which from a lore perspective plays into his extreme precision when handling sharp objects due to his surgical background. However, despite his well-kept exterior, he is a troubled man, someone who is deeply traumatized by the loss of his family and a traumatic early childhood, which leads to his moonscorching and his body being taken a hold of by an infamous being that has been around since humans could record history, the Pocket Cat. In a unique moonscorching cutscene, Pocket Cat will envelop Darn and supposedly take over his body. The Pocket Cat has deep lore within the game's universe, but in summary, the Pocket Cat is a direct servant of the moon god Rare, supposedly created by Rare during Rare's own material presence on Earth. We learn from the new gods that Rare's purpose in the world is driven by selfishness, a deeply jealous old god that made sure no lesser beings would ever ascend to godhood. This is exactly why the Lady of the Moon's only goal in the material world was to capture the little girl, sensing within her the capacity to rise as an ascended god on par with the old. Of course, in the first game, Pocket Cat is still present and seeks the same goal as the Lady of the Moon, asking for the little girl in return for goods. We know the Pocket Cat from the first game may also be the same Pocket Cat in this universe, as the Pocket Cat born from the green hue of the same stuff as the old gods was more than just a material being, and has existed since the dawn of time, often used in old wives' tales to scare children straight. Being a direct servant to any old god is an immensely powerful thing. We know the Lady of the Moon was able to traverse worlds and create miracles directly from the power she sourced from Rare. Similarly, Pocket Cat is no exception, as he's able to conjure powers others, even the greatest Dark Priests or Yellow Mages, could ever dream of. In our battle with the Pocket Cat, he's able to easily dismember our limbs with just his mind, and even cause mind damage to the player through whispering eldritch truths. Both of these tropes play into the immense power direct servants of Rare have, as we know the Lady of the Moon, upon being granted the little girl, can heal all of our limbs as rewards, assuming she could, and by extension the Pocket Cat can, remove them at a moment's notice too. His mind-altering whispers again playing into the trope first seen in the Menaba, where they can commune with us through telepathy, something that can, if held by a more malicious being, such as the Pocket Cat, cause irreparable damage to your mind too, as we do know eldritch truths, particularly from a being that originates from the green hue, can crush the mind of a human in an instant. There are an extremely low amount of true servants of old gods in the entire series. They are often represented in tales as the proxy of an old god's will. We know Vitruvia, Sylvian servant, was able to create humans on a single command. The Pocket Cat's adjacency to these beings suggests a similar power, but with far more malicious intent, as you'd expect from a god concerned only with stopping human ascension. It's not surprising that the tale of the Pocket Cat is as old as time, and his infamy the greatest amongst all of Rare's servants. He represents both the manipulation of Rare, but also its influence in a world filled to the brim with ambitious humans. We'll never know how many potential gods were stopped by his efforts, but the one thing that is for certain is that it was enough to solidify the Pocket Cat's story in the minds of the entire world. Before we move on to the next entry, it's still important to note that the Pocket Cat, while a being that transcended the physical world, may be bound by the capabilities of the human it occupies. And while this isn't developed on within the lore of the game, it does hinder the Pocket Cat from rising to the potential influence of truly godly characters. As an immediate callback to the first game, the Tormented One yet again finds himself at the upper end of a list, as he is, and always will be, a bona fide true new god. We know the lifespan of a new god happens in 3 phases: their life as an ordinary ambitious human, their reign as a new god, and eventually their resignation in a place of limbo known as the Grand Hall. In the game, we can find the Tormented One twice, first in our visions of the Grand Hall sitting amongst his peers, but also in a battle if you invoke his presence through a ritual circle linked to the new gods known as an imperfect circle. But before we get into the fight, who is the Tormented One? If you watched the first video, none of this will be new news, but to summarise, the Tormented One used to be a man named Ron Shambara, a member of a coven of ambitious humans known as the Fellowship. The Fellowship would one day seek Mahabharata to enact a new world order, seeking to treat the conditions of the old world by taking over the old god's influence. Ron, before his ascension beside his peers, was a poet. Obsessed with the pain of life, unsurprisingly, he held a tormented soul, and upon ascension, he would become a new god that became obsessed with inflicting as much pain as possible. Not maliciously, rather as a firm believer in its potential in elevating the human condition. In the first game, we can come face to face with him in Old Mahabharata. In this battle, he has one major hallmark spell, this being the Chains of Torment, a unique ability tied to the god of destruction himself, Gorgoroth. New gods are not weak foes. In fact, they are incredibly powerful and only superseded by old gods and ascended deities. Nothing comes close. Their power so great, just a group of them were able to steer the world at a whim. And in some cases, groups weren't even needed, as we know Nasra, a new god that superseded the Fellowship, single-handedly used his abilities to rule over the Eastern Sanctuaries and lead a belligerent campaign of expansion that even to this day defines territorial lines. We know Nasra would eventually die at the hands of the Fellowship, but refused to remain in the Grand Hall amongst his peers, choosing instead to continue his mission in the real world as a floating head. This is important as we know despite the Tormented One's canonical death in the first game, he may be performing a similar act to Nasra by returning to the world. We know Nasra, upon re-emerging, was a far weaker power when compared to his old form as a new god. He himself explains his power as having been dwindled, and in a similar sense, the re-emergence of the Tormented One, even if it is just for a brief moment, also represents a decrease from the prime power of the Tormented One from the first game. However, the merit of being a new god still absolutely outweighs ordinary beings in the game. Just like the first game, the Kaiser, whose real identity is of course Lagarde, or the Yellow King from the first game, acts as once again the glue that brings everything together. His presence the magnet that makes Preheville such an important section of history. To recap Lagarde's story from the first game, we learn as a resident of Rondon, he represented the growing disdain between the population and its ruling bureaucracy. Eventually he would found a group of mercenaries known as the Knights of the Midnight Sun, proclaiming a new vision for the world unified under a single banner. He quickly rose to prominence in Rondon, his name common amongst its citizens and his future bound by a legacy of greatness. His growing ambitions and support would eventually have Lagarde seeking greater heights to truly unify Europa under his banner, and upon learning of Mahabharata and the route to ascension, he made it his goal that he would ascend as a new god. His travels, though winding, would have him at the foot of the Golden Throne and eventually sitting upon the throne and ascending as a new god, now known as the Yellow King. The first game sort of leaves us hanging here. We aren't told what he did as the Yellow King between the first and second game, centuries later, but we do know his ambitions for unification were stifled due to the emergence of a much greater deity. This of course being the god of fear and hunger, putting Lagarde's godhood in its shadows and his ambitions deeply unfulfilled. However, remaining in the shadows, he would eventually re-emerge as a man known as the Kaiser, taking residence in the Bremen Empire, a great territory neighbouring Rondon, and the old Eastern Sanctuaries in Europa. Not much is known about his life in the Bremen Empire in the early years, and he likely kept a low profile waiting for the right time to enact his old ideas of unification. Of course, as the Cruel Age progressed and humanity's conditions evolved, the god of fear and hunger and the concepts she represented were becoming less relevant to the world's new material conditions, and the Kaiser saw this too. This would eventually come to a head after the discontent caused by the Bremen Empire's first belligerent war, known as the First World War, began to sow within the nation. There isn't much information on the nature of the First War, but we do know from the pamphlet known as The Kaiser's Rise to Power, there was a deep discontent that would brew within the Bremen Empire after it, a discontent that eerily resembled old Rondon, a discontent he knew better than anyone else. Seizing the opportunity once again, the Kaiser would make his presence known, declaring a new political party under a yellow and black banner known as the Marching Men of the Night Day, a play on the Knights of the Midnight Sun. Under this banner he would galvanise the country and eventually rise to power, acting as a chancellor of the nation and eventually its prime overseer. It's believed the Kaiser would utilize horrific acts in consolidating power, and murmurs of his inhumanity would echo throughout the world. This would eventually lead to the neighbouring nations to cast their eye over the Bremen Empire, anticipating further belligerence, something that would indeed come when the Bremen Empire, now under the Kaiser's banner, would seek the annexation of Bohemia, a territory held by the Eastern Union, a coalition of great nations including the Old Eastern Sanctuary. While mysterious at first, we learn through Karen's pamphlet known as the Kaiser Critique that the reason the Kaiser sought Bohemia, and in particular a place known as Preheville, was due to his knowledge about advanced technological development and research happening below Preheville. Something we know is related to the creation of a machine god, Logic. Looking towards this project just as he had with Mahabra's Golden Throne, he sought to become one with this machine and the figurehead to usher humanity into a new age entirely. This is precisely why the Second World War, while entirely biased towards the Bremen Empire, would abruptly come to an end when they had claimed Bohemia as their own. Upon annexation, he would quickly make his way to the White Bunker, only to learn he was too late. Rayla, yet another young woman, has become the catalyst for a new ascended god. However, the Kaiser, now understanding the nature of the world as being too chaotic, would see that his place as a great single god was never the greater scheme of the world, and instead he stands guard of machine logic as it comes online and begins its transformation into a new ascended god, a god to merge human consciousness and knowledge into one great being. This is precisely where we meet him, standing, or should I say sitting before us, and the door to the machine logic. In many ways, this battle with the Yellow King, the Kaiser, is identical to the fight with the Yellow King from the first game. A majority of his moveset is pulled from that first fight to indicate these are both the same deity. However, there is one missing spell, this of course being the spell known as Salvation. While the gameplay isn't anything to go by, the spell Salvation was an immediate game ender, and represented within the lore a sort of optimism Legarde had during his initial transformation into the Yellow King that allowed him to channel an eldritch power that would make your literal head explode. The lack of this spell on the Kaiser indicates he has since fallen from the grace he once assumed at the height of his power as a new god. We know Francois, the great ruler of the First New World Order, at the height of his ascension as a respective yellow, or more accurately speaking, golden god, is far greater than the version we meet in present-day Mahabra in the first game, able to be killed by Nasra in a single flame trick. It's not hard to see a similar degradation having befall Legarde after centuries of waiting too. However, the Kaiser remains a new god in this moment, a new god far greater than a retired new god, as is the case for the Tormented One, and a new god that has never truly been brought down. His current reign is marked with mass casualties, his time as a soldier during the First Great War summarised as the perpetrator of some of the worst atrocities conducted by the Bremen Empire, and the army under his tutelage alone the greatest force in the contemporary world. Legarde's story is one of man's hubris, the tale of great men with even greater intentions led astray by atomistic ideals. I'll let famous poet John Donne and Oscar Wilde explain it best. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Selfishness is not living as one wishes to live, it is asking other people to live as one wishes to live. And in his final moments, Legarde accepts his fate as a part of a much greater scheme, surrendering his internal struggle to be the force for change, battling us as a great new god, but a smaller part of a much greater future, protecting the concept of change itself, even if he has no hand in its mechanisms. The primary distinction between the Tormented One and even the Kaiser to the Heartless One, as previously discussed, is of course both the phases of godhood they are in, but more importantly the relative power of their ascended form. The Heartless One may actually be one of the greatest new gods in the history of the game, a new god still alive in her true new god form, a new god so powerful an old god saw her power as something so great he sought her eternal imprisonment. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go over the key details. In our dialogue with the Heartless One, she proclaims the other gods as senile, warmongering old farts. This contempt over divinity suggests she had, much like Nasra, aligned herself against both new godhood and potentially old gods too, seeking to supersede them herself. We don't get details about how or when she became a new god, but her weapon does paint a very interesting story. Her primary weapon is known as Red Virtue, a weapon we can obtain that tells us of its masterful craftsmanship and potentially being one of 2 swords forged for an ancient king of Mahabra. Of course, we know Mahabra as the old city of the gods, a place created as an altar to commune with the old gods, initially between the primordial lizard race and the true old gods when they still existed closer to the plane of humanity. The ancient king of Mahabra is an interesting story because it's full of loose ends, with theories suggesting it could be an array of incredibly powerful beings, but what's important to note here is that the ancient king of Mahabra was to be the great ruler and stand-in for the old gods after they had left the human world, a being of immense power. During the events of the first game, there are no signs of this ancient ruler, nor even any of the 2 great swords made in its image, which may suggest the Heartless One may have risen as a new god far before the events of the first game. How she came to obtain the blade may again relate to her contempt she had towards divinity, likely having stolen or captured the blade with force only to turn it against the lasting bureaucracy in Mahabra. While far-fetched, this does actually explain how she may have ended up trapped in a realm accessible only through the invocation of Re, as Re is best described by both descriptions and the new gods as a deeply selfish old god that saw the advancement of humans to godhood as an inherently bad thing. This is exactly why her servants, namely the Pocket Cat and even the Lady of the Moon, try to capture the little girl from the first game, as they knew her ascension would go against Re's will. No other new god in the entire game has been given this much attention by Rare in particular. The Heartless One being present in Mahabra during the forging of a weapon meant for an ancient ruler even suggests she may have coincided with Rare's own presence, or even her greater traces in Mahabra soon after Rare's departure. To find the Heartless One, you have to first draw a Rare sigil on a blank asymmetric ritual circle and be transported to Rare's alternate dimension. Here we can find the Heartless One imprisoned behind otherworldly chains. If opened, we face her and she revels in the opportunity to finally be free, eager to brush off the ring rust with us in a battle. In the gameplay, she is without a doubt one of the most, if not the most brutal fight to come to unprepared, able to attack more times than any other enemy and rain debuffs and holy light that can eviscerate the player easily. This translates to the lore too, as we know those who utilise the Red Virtue are of incredible dexterity, and we know she was a great enough threat during her time in Mahabra that she was not only able to procure and wield the Red Virtue, but also turn it against her godly peers. In this moment, we're not just fighting a new god that sought to impose their will onto the world of humans, rather a new god that sought to confront the order of Mahabra itself, while simultaneously being deemed worthy of personal imprisonment by Rare itself, ranking firmly as one of the greatest enemies in the entire series, a champion to triumph over even the new gods of the first game. Percole's position on this list will be a joint entry with the Traces of Rare, purely on the merit that both are now in a symbiotic relationship. Much of Percole's own strength is commanded by his influence over Rare's Traces, and Rare's influence commanded by Percole. Little is known about Percole's past, but we do know he was once an ordinary human. The nature of his ascension to becoming an envoy for Rare's Traces, however, have long since been forgotten. Osar, knowledgeable on the history of the world, suggests Percole has been around for eons, and may have ascended centuries ago, being responsible for a variety of other Termina festivals that have since taken place. Osar acknowledging Percole's presence as a deity in his own right, not unlike a new god. Just like a new god, Percole has been steering much of the course of history much before the events of the second game. The new gods refer to him as a mere leech, leveraging the power of Rare for his own ends. While strange considering Perkele initially poses as a direct servant of Rare, a marionette for the old god's will, we learn from endings B and C that Perkele may have never been a servant of the old moon god, rather a servant to the sulphur god. This is extremely interesting as we know the sulphur god is an aspect of Ulmer that had been discarded after he ascended his pure subconscious to Mahabra, being born again as a pure ascended deity, and the dominant religious figure in the world for a majority of modern human history. However, as we learn, Ulmer may have never been the one in control, as it's indicated Ulmer's corrupted body left in the sulphur pits may have risen as an ascended god beside Ulmer himself, and through history may have come out on top as the true reigning ascended god, explaining why the world after Ulmer's seemingly perfect ascension as the concept of purity itself was never really that pure, no matter how much society put Ulmer at the centre of their worship. How the sulphur god came out on top is not mentioned. As we know, ascended gods often represent concepts that steer humanity in a certain direction. There are theories that suggest humans were never primed for the perfection of Ulmer, and thus the sulphur god, much more relevant to the human condition, would come out on top. A second theory also posits Perkele aware of the sulphur god from the beginning and potentially once existing as a servant of Rare, would align himself with the sulphur god in an attempt to sterilize the ambitions of humanity by ensuring bloodshed and deprivation were to be their material reality, essentially fulfilling Rare's goal but also realigning with another more present god entirely, ensuring Perkele's continued dominance over the course of human history. This also explains the entire purpose of the Termina festival. The appropriation of Rare's light would lay the grounds for a perfect festival of pure bloodshed and betrayal, ensuring humanity would be stuck in a cycle of barbarism, as what more can turn a human against each other than a battle royale where only one can make it out alive. This also explains why Perkele is at the head of the sulphur cult, as he may have been the first person to know of the sulphur god's existence and built a secret cabal of people to help ensure the sulphur god would always have a place in this world. This all suggests Perkele may have been one of the greatest influences in the entire history of the game. Ulmer worship is without a doubt the most prevalent throughout Europa and the wider world, and it may have been Perkele who utilised his mastery in manipulation and trickery through the use of the god of trickery itself that forced the world to worship the sulphur god through the guise of Ulmer. It also explains why crucifixion and sacrifice are all attributed to Ulmer worship. Why would a god of purity and perfect human form require sacrifices to tune their worship? The answer, of course, is that it was always the sulphur god, as sacrifices are well in line with the corruption it espouses. In the game, we are unfortunately yet another victim of Perkele's Termina festival. If we survive, we can ascend the Hollow Tower and finally confront him. Standing before us and in front of the Great Trace of Rare, he fights us with the power of the moon, represented through the spell Lunar Meteorite, and after defeat he is consumed by the traces of Rare itself, leaving only us and an eldritch horror of cosmic proportions. The Traces of Rare is a fight no one should be able to beat, able to warp your entire mind in a single look and focus the entire scorching of the festival in one single direction and bleed you dry by forcing your body through a dreamscape and cosmic storm. You are never supposed to win this battle. But with all that being said, why does a literal trace of an eldritch god not take the first spot? For that, we have to go back to the question, what was Perkele doing in Preheville to begin with? At the end of the first game, we learn the god of fear and hunger would emerge as a symbol of humanity's new era, an era known as the Cruel Age, a period of human development shrouded by struggle, but also perseverance. The Cruel Age would act as a blessing for humanity, as it would prove the race's resilience and ability to overcome the odds set upon them by much greater beings. A great revolution would occur and humanity would organise their society more proficiently, building great cities, unifying previously belligerent lands, and creating infrastructure alien to the old world. However, as humanity came to increased abundance, the god of fear and hunger, and by extension, the concept of resilience in the face of redundancy, was becoming less relevant. Humans were no longer suffering from the conditions of the old ages. They had new problems relevant to a newer world altogether. Humanity in this new age was suffering from a lack of direction, and as the god of fear and hunger dwindled into the backdrop of other deities, humanity came to an impasse, and as Osar puts it, conflicts on religious and political grounds would devastate the world. At the heart of this discontent were the powerhouses of the Eastern Union and the Bremen Empire, both attempting to define a new world. And at the centre of it all was a secret project run by the Eastern Union deep below Prehevil. This project, initially known as Logic, was rumoured to be powerful enough that the one to possess it could potentially change the world forever. As discussed in the Kaiser's entry, this is also why the Bremen Empire sought out Prehevil, as they, or more accurately Legard, now known as the Kaiser, wanted his turn to change the course of history, as Logic was actually an attempt at creating a new ascended god, untethered to the old gods, untethered to Mahabra, and of pure human invention. If humanity was to move forward, it would have to be the master of its own conditions. We learn from Olivia's entry and the story of her twin sister, machine logic was created from a combination of modern human medicine and human-engineered machinery, the purest symbol of humanity's progress since the Cruel Age. And while the Kaiser would successfully annex Bohemia, he was far too late, as Rayla, the primary engineer behind Logic, would become the host for the machine, which is entirely fitting as Logic was to be a new human era that plunged the world into a newer, brighter world, and Rayla, harbouring the radiating soul, was always going to be the perfect host. After making it through the White Bunker, we can encounter the Kaiser. He lets us know the futility of our acts as Logic was online and fully functional, at the cusp of galvanizing all human intelligence into a databank and consolidating humanity into an all-powerful hive mind, no longer divided on cultural, intellectual, political or religious lines, a utopia where humanity shared a single consciousness and thus the material conditions for oppression, hierarchy, violence, and of course, fear and hunger no longer existed. In an attempt to stop this from happening, fearing the loss of our own individualism, we are faced with a machine that utilizes the collective consciousness of humanity, from great scholars to wartime heroes, to pummel our ill-conceived aspirations. And even if we overcome the machine, much like the god of fear and hunger, Logic sees us as no threat. Opening its doors, we are dissolved into a new image of what it means to be human, floating in a sea of green and interlocked with the consciousness of all humanity. We are reborn in a new man-made artificial primordial soup, similar to the green hue the old gods once were, as not a human god, but a god of humanity. In this moment, we learn of the greater scheme laid out for humanity. Since the moment the first human was created in the image of Sylvian, to the day humanity's mother and the other old gods left the material world, to the cultures that would be born throughout the world, the imaginary lines carved on Earth, the unique lessons and morals born from each country, to how humanity matured in different ways in different cultures, we were always destined to be smaller aspects of something much greater. Humanity was always a much greater project altogether. Humans matured from rabid bunnies to new gods, and at the end of the day, all humans played a part in maturing humanity to a point it could all come back together into one single shared consciousness, consolidating every single aspect of human history to birth a new deity, to finally leave Earth and to assume a position amongst the old gods themselves. At the end of our last entry, I asked the question, why was Perkele in Prehevil? And in Logic, we have our answer. Perkele feared what Rare feared the most: human evolution into a god not just on par with the old gods, but potentially even greater. And at the end of the machine's transformation and the fusion of every human mind, a new God is born. And as we know, all great gods represent great concepts. This God of humanity, a God that saw through archaic practices of worship and ego, could be nothing other than the God of logic.